Welcome to the historic blah, a place where the past moves very slowly, where kings wrote letters that took months to arrive, and farmers counted the seasons, one gentle sunrise at a time. Tonight we'll wander through the calm corridors of history, no wars, no drama, just the quiet turning of time. So take a deep breath, let your thoughts drift like leaves on a still pond. And if you find peace in these sleepy stories, you can like, comment, and subscribe. Not out of urgency, but simply whenever you wake up. For now, close your eyes and let history whisper you to sleep. Welcome to Beautifully Boring History. Now beginning. Story 1. The Rise of the Vizier, Power Behind the Throne. You find yourself beside the slow, dependable current of the Nile, sometime around 2700 BCE. The sun is just cresting the horizon, casting golden light over the rippling waters and illuminating the stone courtyards of Memphis, the capital of a newly unified Egypt. The city hums quietly, not with the noise of modern machines, but with the distant thud of chisels against limestone, the soft shuffle of sandals against packed earth, and the murmur of scribes recording grain tallies on smooth clay pallets. You might expect the king NSWT, the pharaoh, to be the primary figure of interest in such a setting. But if you follow the flow of real power, you will find it slipping quietly into the hands of another, the vizier, or TJD. A figure dressed not in glittering gold, but in modest linen robes, clasping not a scepter but a scroll. The vizier did not build pyramids, at least not with his hands. He did not fight wars or perform religious rites. Yet he was the one who made everything happen. He was the glue binding the kingdom's sprawling administrative machine together. The emergence of the vizier. To understand how the position of the vizier emerged, we must look first to the challenges that followed the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt under Narmer, and the establishment of a centralized state under the kings of the Third Dynasty. With consolidation came complexity. Ruling a single village or tribe was one thing. Administering a nation that stretched over 1,000 kilometers of fertile valley, with hundreds of thousands of people, was another. The pharaoh, though revered as divine, could not be everywhere. He could not inspect every tax record or oversee every shipment of grain. Someone had to do it in his name, and thus emerged the vizier not from grandeur but from necessity. At first this role was fluid. Royal sons often held the title, but by the reign of Djoser, the first king of the Third Dynasty, the role was formalized. Djoser's own vizier, Imhotep, was immortalized not for his political power, but for his mind. Architect, physician, astronomer, and priest, Imhotep represented the ideal vizier, wise, capable, and silent in his efficiency. The vizier's role was clear, to execute the will of the king. But as the bureaucracy grew, so did the responsibilities that trickled down to him. Eventually, the vizier was not only the second in command of Egypt, but also the ultimate supervisor of its inner workings. The office of the vizier. Let's imagine for a moment that you are walking through the office of a vizier in the reign of Sneferu, founder of the Fourth Dynasty. The walls are lined with papyrus scrolls and limestone slabs, engraved with figures and columns of hieroglyphs. Scribes are hunched over desks, their reed pens dipping rhythmically into red and black ink. The air is thick with the smell of oil lamps and faintly acrid ink. At the center of this activity is the vizier himself, reviewing a report from the overseer of granaries. Another document details the shipment of copper tools to a construction site in the desert. A third is a petition from a provincial governor requesting additional laborers. The vizier's responsibilities extended across tax collection and oversight of granaries, supervision of regional governors, nomarchs, command of the royal works, including construction and labor drafts, maintenance of law and justice, approval of public works and religious festivals. He even oversaw the royal seal. No document was official unless it bore the vizier's stamp. In practice, This meant he was the bottleneck of the state's operations, not in the sense of a delay, but as the point through which everything passed. His word, while not divine, was as binding as the king. Social status and daily life. The vizier lived in both luxury and obligation. He had a large estate, attended by servants and protected by guards, yet his life was not one of leisure. He began work at dawn, often before the king. Each day involved hearings, reports, and the settling of disputes. His word resolved conflicts of land, inheritance, theft, or improper tax assessments. What's striking is not the grandeur of his tasks, but the sheer mundanity of it all. The vizier was a bureaucrat, and his power was buried in logistics. A surviving document known as the Duties of the Vizier from the New Kingdom, based on Old Kingdom structures, outlines expectations: impartiality in judicial matters, cleanliness, honesty in grain weighing, and respect for royal protocol. These were not glorious duties. They were exacting. They were dull. And yet they held the kingdom together. A government of paper and people. At the heart of the vizier's effectiveness was Egypt's growing bureaucracy. Scribes, trained from childhood, formed the foundation of this system. Their work recording, calculating, storing created the informational infrastructure that made governance possible. Without them, the vizier was blind. This is where the story becomes surprisingly human. Scribes made mistakes, governors were late, floods destroyed stored documents, rebellions in the south disrupted communication, and yet the system endured. Why? Because the vizier anticipated chaos. He planned not just for today, but for seasons and generations ahead. He stockpiled grain, enforced record duplication, rotated labor teams, and maintained steady contact with temple complexes that often doubled as regional centers of administration. He had to balance the needs of the people with the will of the king, the limits of nature with the demands of construction. It was a life of managing expectations and consequences. Legacy and longevity. One might wonder, how could such a centralized role remain effective for centuries? The answer lies in tradition. The vizier's office became its own institution, passed not always by blood but often by merit or training. Sons of scribes became assistant officials, then overseers, and eventually, if capable, viziers. The titles changed little, the tools almost not at all. Even as dynasties fell, the vizier remained a fixture of governance. This enduring model influenced future kingdoms as well. The idea of a chief minister, a non-royal figure who manages the operations of state, would appear in Assyria, Babylon, Persia, and eventually the grand viziers of Islamic caliphates. Egypt, as always, had quietly set the template. But even the most powerful viziers could not avoid the creeping complexity of the world they helped build. As Egypt's population grew and new regions were absorbed, the tasks mounted. More scribes, more reports, more chances for corruption or oversight. What happens when the center can no longer hold, and the vizier's grasp begins to slip? If you walked into the vizier's court at dawn during the reign of Khufu, the builder of the Great Pyramid, you wouldn't be greeted by silence. You'd find a quiet but organized chaos, runners delivering reports, scribes organizing tax records, a governor waiting to plead for grain assistance after a poor harvest. The vizier, poised at the center of this intricate web, held not a sword but a stylus, and that was enough. The vizier was more than a servant of the pharaoh. He was the daily decision-maker in a kingdom that needed precision to survive. But how did one man manage such a wide-reaching apparatus? And more importantly, how did the office avoid collapsing under its own weight? The machinery of governance. Egypt's Old Kingdom bureaucracy was more than a loose collection of scribes and overseers. It was a living machine. Every year, every month, even every 10-day week, called a decade, was carefully tracked. Nothing was left to chance. The Nile's floods were measured and compared to records. Taxes were assessed by regional surveyors and compiled into tables that would be reviewed by the vizier's staff. But paper alone didn't hold it together. Human relationships mattered. The vizier had to build trust across a decentralized system. In reality, most pharaohs rarely left their palace complex, but the vizier had to maintain relationships with nomarchs, provincial governors. These were powerful figures, often local elites, responsible for managing individual nomes' regions. The vizier coordinated with them on tax collection, labor conscription, and law enforcement. Temple administrators. Temples weren't just places of worship. They were among the wealthiest institutions in Egypt. They owned land, employed workers, and maintained their own records. The vizier had to walk a tightrope respecting their religious autonomy while ensuring loyalty to the pharaoh. Overseers of works. These men ran the vast labor systems, especially those involved in construction. Whether a pyramid, temple, or canal was being built, the vizier signed off on it and, more importantly, ensured it was supplied. Every connection was supported by paperwork. But beyond that, it was supported by tradition, fear, and diplomacy. Grain, justice, and the real currency of control. If the vizier had a throne, it wasn't in a palace, it was beside a granary. Egypt's economy was not based on coinage, which came much later. It was based on grain, labor, and materials, and grain was the most important. During the inundation season, when the Nile flooded, farmers could not work their fields. During this time, they were often conscripted into state projects, pyramid construction, canal digging, or temple repairs. But come harvest, the state collected grain taxes, often 10% or more. The vizier's staff oversaw the collection, storage, and distribution of this grain. If one region experienced a poor harvest, grain had to be sent from another. If workers needed to be fed for a large project, the vizier had to ensure grain was moved before spoilage. This required a series of overlapping institutions. The Granary Department, Parchment, responsible for storing and managing grain reserves. The Treasury, per hedge, managed other valuables like gold, copper, cloth, and incense. The Record House, per Medjet, housed archives, contracts, and legal decisions. But grain alone wasn't enough. Justice was critical. The vizier also functioned as chief judge. Legal records show that the vizier presided over disputes related to property boundaries, inheritance, false weights in markets, and even theft. While serious crimes could be escalated to the pharaoh, the vizier's word was final in most matters. A section from the Duties of the Vizier reads, "When a petitioner comes to you about a matter, examine it yourself, for it is the means by which you maintain order." Justice, like grain, kept the system stable. Corruption, surveillance, and the risk of failure. A system this vast is always vulnerable to incompetence, deception, or both. It is no surprise that warnings about corruption appear even in Old Kingdom texts. One surviving edict instructs the vizier to inspect the inspectors and weigh the weights himself. Auditing was not new. Each level of bureaucracy had another watching over it. Regional overseers were required to submit detailed logs. Scribes from Memphis might be dispatched without warning to verify a tax report. Markets were regulated with strict laws about trade and measurement. Still, some viziers like Cajmni under Sneferu openly lamented the challenge of maintaining integrity. Cajmni wrote in his instruction to his sons, "The good official is quiet, and his household prospers. The bad one is loud, and his grain disappears." These were more than moral teachings. They were warnings. An official who hoarded grain, forged documents, or failed to report honestly endangered not only his own career but the kingdom's stability. Death and the politics of burial. The vizier's death was not the end of his influence. In fact, his tomb often became a statement of his life's work. Many viziers of the Old Kingdom were buried near their kings. The necropolis at Saqqara near Memphis is filled with the mastabas, flat-roofed tombs of elite officials. Their tombs often included inscriptions not of military victories, but of completed grain surveys, resolved disputes, and architectural projects. Take Ptahhotep, a vizier under Jedkare IC 5th dynasty. His tomb contains the maxims of Ptahhotep, one of the earliest works of wisdom literature in human history. In it, he emphasizes humility, patience, and listening. If you are a leader, calm yourself when you hear a petitioner's words, for the great man is one who listens, not one who speaks always. These teachings weren't just for show. They were designed to train the next generation of scribes and bureaucrats. It was a form of bureaucratic legacy building, meant to survive long after death. And yet, these grand tombs also hint at a truth the state preferred to hide. The vizier's power was so immense, it sometimes rivaled that of the king. Dual viziers and the limits of trust. By the end of the 5th dynasty, a subtle shift began to emerge. The pharaohs, perhaps worried about centralized power, began appointing 2 viziers instead of one for Lower Egypt North, and one for Upper Egypt South. This move speaks volumes. The vizier, once a singular figure, was now split by geography. Perhaps this was a political strategy. Perhaps the workload had truly grown too large. Perhaps both. The division didn't destroy the office, it transformed it. Each vizier now had slightly less power, but more regional autonomy. They reported to the same pharaoh but managed different areas of the kingdom. It also increased the size of the state apparatus. 2 courts, 2 sets of scribes, and a more complex hierarchy. Coordination between them now became one of the chief administrative challenges. And here we begin to glimpse a danger. When a bureaucracy becomes too big to fail, it becomes too big to function. As the state stretched to manage provinces, temples, and a growing population, even a capable vizier could not solve every crisis. The final centuries of the Old Kingdom saw growing regionalism. Nomarchs began acting independently. Grain shipments were delayed. Communication slowed. Some historians suggest that it was not an external invasion or dramatic rebellion that ended the Old Kingdom, but a quiet breakdown of administration. What happens when the grain stops flowing and the scribes put down their pens? The Grand Vizier sat at the center of the Egyptian state like the axle of a mighty chariot. For generations, he had turned the gears of government quietly, invisibly, dependably. But no machine, however well-oiled, runs forever. As the 6th dynasty wore on, the gears began to grind. It was not a single failure that brought the Old Kingdom to its knees. There was no dramatic coup, no enemy invasion, no celestial cataclysm. Rather, it was an accumulation of small breakdowns, unbalanced ledgers, disobedient nomarchs, granaries emptied too soon, floodwaters too low, officials more loyal to themselves than to Pharaoh. And when these things happened all at once, the vizier could no longer hold the center. This is the story of how quiet decay unraveled a system that once held the most powerful civilization on Earth, and what echoes it left behind. Pepi II and the problem of longevity. The final decades of the Old Kingdom unfolded under the rule of Pepi II, who is believed to have reigned for over 90 years, the longest reign of any monarch in recorded history. On the surface, this might seem a symbol of stability, but in practice, such a lengthy reign introduced chaos. As Pepi II aged, the viziers around him changed. Generations passed, each vizier inheriting a more fractured system than the last. While the pharaoh still held divine status, his reach weakened. Local officials, nomarchs, temple authorities, and regional overseers began to assert their own power. The once unified bureaucracy split, not violently, but inevitably. Letters from the time hint at gaps in grain deliveries, legal disputes going unresolved, and royal edicts taking months to implement if they were obeyed at all. The vizier, once the linchpin of national coordination, found his authority diluted by distance, time, and distrust. And even with the creation of dual viziers, one for upper and one for lower, Egypt the system buckled under its own weight. The rise of the nomarchs, bureaucracy goes local. As the central authority weakened, nomarchs' regional governors began to act with increasing autonomy. Initially appointed by the pharaoh, many positions became hereditary. These men were not revolutionaries. They did not seek to overthrow the king, but they saw that the throne in Memphis no longer had the resources to enforce control. In absence of strong oversight from the vizier, nomarchs began building their own local treasuries, maintaining independent militias, constructing elaborate tombs rivaling those of central elites, inscribing inscriptions that praised their own authority, not the king's. One of the most telling examples comes from the tomb of a nomarch in Asiut, who referred to himself as the one who gives orders in his district, a phrase once reserved for the king or his vizier. Egypt, once run like a tightly held papyrus scroll, was beginning to fray at the edges. Economic breakdown and the failure of the grain system. The heart of the Old Kingdom economy was grain both as sustenance and as a unit of exchange. The entire administrative structure, managed by the vizier, relied on predictable Nile floods to grow, tax, store, and redistribute grain across the kingdom. But the late 6th dynasty faced a series of low inundations. The river did not flood as high or as long as it needed to. The result was smaller harvests, tighter food reserves, and unrest. As starvation loomed in some regions, provincial officials began hoarding grain, either to protect their people or increase their own leverage. The vizier's system of redistribution failed. Where once he could command shipments from Gnome 14 to Gnome 3, now the orders were ignored or delayed beyond usefulness. The central government, dependent on full granaries to feed workers, reward temples, and maintain loyalty, found itself increasingly irrelevant. No amount of administrative skill could conjure food from barren fields. The vizier, ledgers grew full of reports, but empty of solutions. Collapse without a bang, the end of the Old Kingdom. Historians now believe that the collapse of the Old Kingdom was not a sudden fall but a slow, administrative death. Royal tombs shrank in scale. Monumental buildings ceased. The wealth once used to glorify kings was redirected or vanished. The once immaculate bureaucratic system unraveled. Without grain, construction stopped. Without construction, laborers returned home. Without taxes, scribes had nothing to record. Without obedience, the vizier's orders became suggestions. Records from the early First Intermediate Period, what followed the Old Kingdom, describe lawlessness and fragmentation. One grim text, the Admonitions of Ipuwer, though poetic and perhaps exaggerated, tells of chaos. The officials are slain. Their writings are stolen. Behold, the granaries are empty. Their contents are scattered. He who once wore fine linen now wears rags. Whether or not this reflects literal truth, the sentiment is clear. The bureaucracy had failed, and with it, the quiet stability of Egypt's first golden age dissolved. What happened to the viziers? After the fall, the office of vizier did not disappear, it adapted. During the First Intermediate Period, viziers likely existed in name, but their power was regional, aligned with local warlords or governors. Without a strong central state, the vizier was no longer the axle of the wheel but one of many spokes. By the time Egypt reunited under the Middle Kingdom, the vizier's role was resurrected but with caution. New systems of checks and balances were introduced. For example, records were double-scribed, often by separate departments. Viziers were rotated or limited in term length. The king maintained direct oversight of critical decisions. The lessons of the Old Kingdom's collapse were not forgotten. In later periods, including the New Kingdom, viziers remained powerful, but their autonomy was tempered. The office became more ceremonial, with real power divided among multiple ministries. Reflections: bureaucracy as a force of civilization. So what do we make of the vizier not just as a man, but as a function? The vizier did not dazzle like the pharaoh. He did not incite awe with massive tombs or grand processions, but he held civilization together. He was the filter between divinity and reality, between decree and execution. And when he faltered, the pyramid building stopped not just physically, but symbolically. The lesson here is a quiet one. Civilizations fall not when their warriors fail, but when their ledgers do. The moment records become meaningless, laws unenforced, and grain undelivered, the real decline begins. And yet there is something noble in the vizier's obscurity. He is not remembered by schoolchildren, nor glorified in modern fiction. His work was slow, deliberate, and dull. But it was also essential. Even now, in modern governments and corporations, echoes of the vizier remain. The chief of staff, the secretary of state, the director of operations. Titles change, empires rise and fall, but the need for coordination never disappears. So we must ask, in every civilization, who truly holds the power, those who issue commands, or those who make them happen? Story 2. Scribes and sealbearers, the invisible architects of Egypt. You are standing in the dim corner of an Egyptian administrative office, perhaps in Memphis, or in a provincial town along the banks of the Nile. A man in linen sits hunched over a piece of papyrus, a thin reed pen between his fingers. He dips it carefully into a palette of red and black ink, then scribbles small symbols with swift, practiced strokes. To the untrained eye, it's indecipherable, but to him, it's as clear as speech. He's a scribe, a living repository of information, and though his name will never be carved into a pyramid, his role shapes everything around you. Next to him, another man carefully presses a carved stone cylinder into soft clay, leaving a seal impression that confirms the message's authenticity. He is a seal bearer, and this single gesture, quiet and methodical, carries the authority of the state. Together, these two figures, the scribe and the seal bearer, formed the administrative nervous system of ancient Egypt. The lifeblood of bureaucracy, writing as control. In the Old Kingdom, knowledge was power, but not abstract philosophical knowledge. This was practical, logistical knowledge. How many sacks of grain were harvested? Who owed taxes? Which gnomes had delivered their labor quotas? Which overseers had died or been reassigned? The scribe recorded it all. Writing in Old Kingdom Egypt wasn't just for record keeping. It was a tool of state control. The very act of writing turned reality into policy. A grain shipment unrecorded was a grain shipment that, administratively, didn't exist. Scribes were everywhere. In the granary, in construction camps, in the temple, in courtrooms. Some managed simple tallies. Others composed royal decrees. A few even wrote instructional texts and maxims, guides for how a young official should behave. To become a scribe was to step into a world of privilege. Education began young, often at the house of life, a scriptorium associated with temples. Training included memorizing signs, practicing calligraphy, learning mathematics, and understanding legal formulas. A well-trained scribe could expect a life free from manual labor, with access to court, and perhaps, eventually, promotion into higher offices. It is telling that many elite tombs show their owners seated with a writing palette, an emblem of intellectual authority, even more than wealth or martial skill. Tools of the trade, the reed and the palette. What did a scribe carry? A palette, usually wooden, with two ink pots, red used for headings or names, and black used for the main text. A reed brush calamus, sliced to a fine point. Rolls of papyrus, made from the reeds of the Nile, sliced, pressed, and dried. Occasionally, limestone flakes or ostraca, potsherds, were used for rough notes or calculations. A trained scribe could write with elegant speed. The most skilled developed personal flourishes like modern calligraphers. But speed was not just an art, it was necessity. Administrative life generated constant paperwork. tax receipts, inventories, legal cases, festival schedules, labor rosters. Without scribes, the entire administrative structure of the vizier explored in our last story would have collapsed. The seal-bearers, authority in a cylinder. Now beside every scribe you would often find another quiet figure, the seal-bearer. In an age where official documents were the foundation of government, authentication was critical. The seal-bearer carried the personal seal of an official, sometimes his own, sometimes a superior's. This small stone, carved in intaglio, often cylindrical or scarab-shaped, would be pressed into clay or wax to confirm the identity of the sender. The seal was more than a signature, it was a badge of office, a mark of trust. There were layers to this position. Bearer of the seal of the king of Lower Egypt, an exalted title that appeared early in the Old Kingdom. These seal-bearers were close to the pharaoh, managing access to treasury, goods, and documents. Overseers of seals, often paired with granary or treasury departments, these officials ensured that nothing was moved without authorization. They did not merely apply seals, they controlled access to storehouses, to wealth, to information. No grain could be removed from a state granary unless the seal-bearer had applied the proper insignia. No edict could be considered valid without his impression. In a sense, the seal-bearer held the power of confirmation. Without him, the written word was suspect. With him, it became law. Invisible but indispensable. The remarkable thing about these two professions, scribe and seal-bearer, is how invisible they were in the larger narratives of Egyptian history. Pharaohs built pyramids, viziers signed decrees, priests conducted rituals, but scribes and seal-bearers enabled all of them to function. Their names rarely appear in textbooks, yet thousands of their documents survive. A scribe's record of a labor team assigned to a quarry expedition. A seal impression confirming delivery of linen to a temple. A letter between two officials regarding the delay in a shipment of copper tools. These documents, mundane though they seem, are the historical memory of the state. In fact, Egyptologists know more about Old Kingdom administration than some later periods precisely because of these dry records. The rise of the scribal elite. By the mid-5 dynasty, scribehood had become a pathway to elite status. Many high officials began their careers as scribes. Tomb inscriptions often proudly declare titles like Chief Scribe of the King's Documents, Scribe of the Granary of the North, Scribe who oversees the divine offerings. These men rose through ranks by mastering administration. Promotions were often based on competence, not just lineage, and as the state expanded, the need for scribes only grew. The most gifted scribes might even be elevated to overseers, governors, or assistant viziers. Their education gave them tools beyond ink mathematics, surveying, law, and protocol. In many ways, they were the problem solvers of the ancient world, even if their solutions came written in careful hieroglyphs on a crumbling scroll. Gender and literacy, who got to write? There is little evidence that women were trained as scribes in the Old Kingdom, though some elite women may have been literate. Literacy was tied to administration, and therefore largely to male-dominated positions. That said, literacy itself was extremely rare. Most Egyptians, farmers, craftsmen, even soldiers could not read or write. This created a powerful information gap. Scribes and seal-bearers thus occupied an elite intellectual class. They could interpret the law. They could draft appeals. They could craft messages to the pharaoh. In doing so, they acted as gatekeepers to power. It was a quiet power, yes, but it was real. The scribe in death. Like the viziers, scribes often memorialized their work in tombs. Reliefs show them seated cross-legged with a palette and papyrus scroll. Inscriptions praise their skill with words. One tomb inscription reads, I was the one who wrote the records of the granaries, and no error was found. I wrote what was spoken and sealed what was written. This simple statement captures the essence of the profession: clarity, accuracy, and authority. In the end, the scribe's work was not about glory. It was about getting things done, feeding workers, documenting deaths, preparing festivals, recording laws. They were not warriors or kings. They were civil servants in the truest and most enduring sense. But what happens when the demands of the state grow faster than its scribes can write? When too many seals are affixed to too many documents, and no one remembers what was authorized and what was not? Could the very system of writing and sealing that once brought order begin to collapse under its own complexity? The image of the scribe is serene, a man seated in quiet concentration, brush in hand, inscribing the will of the state onto papyrus. But beneath this composed surface lay an increasingly overloaded machine. As Egypt entered the mid to late Old Kingdom, its administrative complexity ballooned. More gnomes, more temples, more taxes, more building projects, more labor rotations. For every new shipment of grain or conscription order, someone had to write, copy, transport, verify, file, and seal the documentation. The scribes and seal-bearers, once the engine of efficient governance, now found themselves drowning in their own success. This section explores how the proliferation of writing and its supporting bureaucracy began to overwhelm the very system it once strengthened. The expansion of records, a paper empire. The Egyptian state, ever cautious, had a deep-rooted compulsion to document everything. Census records to assess tax obligation, birth and death notices for labor and inheritance tracking, land surveys to define ownership and ensure fair taxation, festival calendars detailing offerings and participation, legal proceedings stored in archives for years or decades. At first, this served order. Written records resolved disputes, prevented corruption, and ensured consistency. But as generations passed, the volume of records increased exponentially. More importantly, records began duplicating. A single grain shipment might be recorded by the local granary scribe, copied for the overseer of the gnome, sealed by the regional seal-bearer, reported upward to the vizier's central archive, transcribed into a delivery receipt for the recipient. Each step required physical writing, transport, and validation. Over time, this created an intricate web of documentation that, while impressive, was vulnerable to human error and delay. When every action required a document, and every document a seal, the system became bureaucratically top-heavy. The rise of red tape. Bureaucracy slows the state. It's tempting to view the Old Kingdom administration as an efficient machine, and in many ways it was. But even ancient states could suffer from what we now call red tape. Examples of bureaucratic congestion emerge in documents from the late Old Kingdom. A letter from an overseer complains that a copper tool delivery is delayed because the granary requires a replacement seal for a lost document. A provincial scribe requests clarification on a tax edict that contradicts an earlier decree, both documents sealed, but with different titles. A shipment of linen destined for a temple is held in a storehouse for over 2 months because the official authorized to break the seal is unavailable. These may seem minor, but multiplied across dozens of gnomes and hundreds of administrative offices, the result was a system constantly lagging behind reality. By the 6th dynasty, the administrative load became so dense that officials stopped recording smaller transactions altogether. They relied on oral agreements or unofficial notes decisions, which, while practical, undermined the integrity of the bureaucratic process. The seal-bearer's dilemma: power without oversight. As paperwork increased, so did the power of the seal-bearer. Initially a safeguard against forgery, the seal-bearer had now become a bottleneck. Only he or someone he authorized could validate a document. Without his impression, a shipment didn't exist, an order couldn't proceed, a tax wasn't collectible. But this concentration of power brought risk. We begin to see references in administrative texts to missing seals, or officials refusing to act unless their personal seal was respected. There are even recorded accusations of deliberate withholding of seals to extract bribes, loss or duplication of seals, a security crisis, counterfeiting, with seal impressions altered or faked. A single corrupted seal bearer could hold hostage an entire administrative chain. And without a system to audit or replace him swiftly, the machine stalled. Scribal burnout and the limits of literacy. For scribes, the problem wasn't only administrative, it was existential. A scribe's job was rooted in precision, patience, and permanence. But as the system ballooned, those values were harder to uphold. Errors crept in. Red ink was misapplied. Quantities were transposed. Legal formulas were inconsistently followed. The growing number of new scribes trained hastily to meet demand lacked the refinement of their predecessors. A satirical text from the first intermediate period mocks this decline. They are called scribes, but they write like drunkards. The tax man reads 10 where the scroll says 1, and the seal bearer cannot remember which seal is his. Whether hyperbolic or not, it reflects a loss of confidence in the system's core function, reliability, storage, decay, and the problem of permanence. Even assuming scribes performed flawlessly, another issue loomed: storage. Egyptian archives weren't libraries of climate-controlled stone chambers. Most documents were stored in wooden chests or reed containers in government offices or temples. Over time, papyrus deteriorated. Insects, floods, fire, and simple humidity erased records. Older documents became unreadable. And without centralized indexing systems or formal archives, retrieving past documents became difficult or impossible. The more the state relied on its written memory, the more fragile its memory became. Eventually, officials stopped trying to retrieve old records unless absolutely necessary. Instead, they duplicated or rewrote decrees, further inflating the paperwork burden. This recursive system, writing to fix writing, created what we might now call data bloat. Temples, duplication, and conflicting bureaucracies. As administrative pressure mounted, temples stepped into the vacuum. Temples had their own scribe corps, their own seal bearers, and their own internal record systems. While they were technically subordinate to the vizier and the state, they often acted independently. Temple records began diverging from state records. A shipment of wheat might be recorded in one, but not the other. Priests began collecting taxes or donations outside state channels, leading to conflicting reports. This dual bureaucracy, temple and state, further burdened scribes, who now had to reconcile or duplicate documents for both systems. And seal bearers became pawns in political disputes. Whose seal mattered more, the state's or the temple? A crisis in confidence, when records no longer reassure. As the old kingdom edged toward collapse, a shift occurred not in numbers but in faith. Officials no longer believed that the system could track everything. Scribes questioned whether their reports mattered. Seal bearers hesitated to approve transactions they couldn't verify. Petitions were delayed, often indefinitely, for lack of clerical capacity. The system didn't fail with a bang, it failed with a backlog. The very tools that once brought order, writing, sealing, recording, now contributed to stagnation. Too many seals, too many scrolls, too many minor officials interpreting too many conflicting decrees. In the end, the bureaucracy receded not because it was wrong, but because it became unsustainable. The human cost of collapse. For the scribes and seal bearers, this wasn't merely a professional crisis, it was a personal one. Many lost their positions as regional power shifted to nomarchs. Some scribes joined temple staff instead, seeking patronage from the priesthood. Others became private letter writers or legal clerks for wealthy families. The training remained valuable, but the prestige faded. Tombs from the late Old Kingdom and early First Intermediate period show a noticeable decline in the grandeur of scribal burials. Modest inscriptions replaced elaborate reliefs. Titles became vague scribe, not overseer of the granary documents. The scribes who had once chronicled the glory of pharaohs now recorded petitions from peasants, grain accounts for struggling temples, or death registers in a time of famine. But did the pen ever truly stop moving? Even amid collapse, the act of writing never disappeared. In fact, writing endured precisely because it was decentralized. As the central state crumbled, smaller courts, temples, and merchant houses kept scribes. Seal-bearers shifted their allegiance to regional powers. The script evolved, but it lived on. The scribal tradition would rise again in the Middle Kingdom, more sophisticated, more regulated, and more aware of its own fragility. The very failure of the Old Kingdom system became a lesson in restraint and reform. So we must ask, what happens when a society creates too many records to read, too many systems to manage, too many seals to control? Can a civilization survive if its scribes no longer believe their words matter? As Egypt entered the uncertain twilight of the Old Kingdom, the work of scribes and seal-bearers didn't vanish into the sands. While central authority crumbled and regional powers rose, the tools of statecraft remained. The palette, the reed pen, the seal. If anything, they became more necessary, adapted, reused, reinterpreted. What we often overlook is that even during collapse, life continues. Food must be counted, land must be inherited, disputes must be settled, and for all these things someone must write, someone must witness, someone must authorize. This final section explores the enduring legacy of Egypt's scribes and seal-bearers, not as symbols of a lost age, but as survivors who carried the flame of administration through chaos, reform, and rebirth. A profession endures. When the Old Kingdom's central system fractured after the reign of Pepi II, scribes and seal-bearers didn't simply disappear. They shifted downward in the structure of authority. Now, instead of answering to the vizier, many scribes answered to nomarchs, who had assumed semi-independent control over provinces; temple authorities, whose wealth and influence surged in the absence of strong pharaonic oversight; merchant families, emerging as landowners or grain dealers in the vacuum of royal management. Even as state funding dried up, private households began employing scribes. Literacy, once a marker of elite bureaucratic status, became a serviceable skill, a trade, like stone-cutting or weaving. Seal-bearers followed a similar trajectory. Those who had once borne the king's seal now bore local emblems of regional courts, temples, or even commercial enterprises. The concept of authentication, once sacred, became practical. It's a remarkable testimony to Egyptian resilience. Even when centralized government failed, its technologies of record-keeping endured. Writing as legitimacy. One of the most powerful legacies of the scribe's profession is the way writing itself became a form of legitimacy. In the early First Intermediate period, 2180–2055 BCE, several competing rulers claimed to be the true heirs of the pharaohs. How did they assert this? Not through conquest, but through documents. They issued edicts, tax reforms, temple endowments, and letters, all inscribed using the same scribal formulas, symbols of continuity. They commissioned scribes to copy Old Kingdom inscriptions, mimicking the style of past pharaohs. In a land where the spoken word faded quickly and memory was fragile, a written name outlived the speaker. The ability to write like the old state became evidence of one's right to rule. Thus, even as political power fragmented, the script of power remained unified. The Middle Kingdom, restoration through literacy. By the 11th and 12th dynasties, Egypt had begun to reunify under a new line of kings from Thebes. These rulers recognized something critical. To restore the nation, they had to restore the bureaucracy. They did not build anew. They revived what had once worked. Scribal schools were reopened or expanded. Standardized training manuals were produced. Some of the most famous Egyptian literary texts, the instructions of Amenemhat, the satire of the trades, the prophecies of Nefertiti, date to this period. Seal protocols were tightened. No longer were seals individualized. Instead, institutional seals became more common, emphasizing role over person. The Middle Kingdom rulers framed themselves as heirs to Old Kingdom order, not merely in spirit, but in paperwork. And at the heart of this renaissance were the scribes and sealbearers. They didn't just restore administration, they restored national identity. The scribe in Egyptian thought, more than a clerk. In the New Kingdom and beyond, the scribe evolved into something more than a bureaucrat. He became a symbol of wisdom, order, and continuity. Tomb art began to portray scribes with exaggerated calmness, composure, and even smugness. Texts praised the profession. Be a scribe. It saves you from toil and brings you closer to the gods. In fact, the most famous Egyptian literary piece, the Satire of the Trades, is a propaganda text that humorously mocks every other profession: fishermen, carpenters, farmers as filthy and painful, while elevating the scribe as pure, clean, and noble. This wasn't entirely untrue. Scribes were spared manual labor. They had access to temple food stores, better housing, and education for their children. But more importantly, they were viewed as guardians of civilization. They held the instructions of the past. They maintained the rituals of the present. They preserved names for the future. Even in the afterlife, writing mattered. Many tombs included offering formulas and autobiographies to be read by the living. The belief was simple: to speak the name of the dead is to make them live again. And who wrote those names? The scribe. Seal-bearers in symbol and function. Seal-bearers, too, retained their prestige, though less celebrated in literature. They remained symbols of authority. In later periods, elaborate seal boxes were buried with officials. Seal impressions were treated with legal force, and seal-bearers became custodians of institutional memory. Their job was more than security. It was witnessing. The presence of a seal-bearer in a transaction made it binding. In temple transactions, their role resembled that of a notary public today: official, neutral, respected. In fact, the dual role of the scribe as author and the seal-bearer as witness became the backbone of all Egyptian contracts, from land grants to marriage agreements. Influence beyond Egypt, a model for the ancient world. Egypt's scribal system was so successful that it influenced other cultures. In Mesopotamia, scribes using cuneiform performed similar functions, but Egypt's integration of script, administration, and ideology was more unified. In the Levant and Nubia, Egyptian-trained scribes carried hieratic script and seal protocols abroad. Later, the Greeks in Ptolemaic Egypt would adopt scribal structures, blending Greek and Egyptian record-keeping for taxation and land surveys. Even the Roman Empire, centuries later, would mirror Egyptian structures: provincial governors, state scribes, official seals. The Egyptian model endured not through conquest, but through paperwork. A quiet immortality. It's tempting to view pharaohs as the immortal ones encased in stone, wrapped in myth, but in truth, many of their names were lost. Their monuments crumbled, their stories faded. And yet, thousands of scribes, most unknown by name, live on through their work. A tax list on papyrus tucked in the Cairo Museum. A grain delivery docket excavated from a workers' village near Giza. A seal impression from a forgotten granary unearthed in Aswan. These fragments, dry and technical, tell the real story of Egypt, a story not of kings and wars, but of rice tallies, festival budgets, and scribbled corrections in red ink. Even the Old Kingdom's most monumental achievement, the pyramids, owes its existence not just to laborers or architects, but to bureaucrats. For every block placed, someone recorded its origin, transit, and delivery. Someone authorized its movement. Someone double-checked the count. Without the scribe, the pyramid was not built. Without the seal-bearer, the stone did not move. Final reflections: the power of the small pen. The story of scribes and seal-bearers is a reminder that great civilizations are built not just by visionaries, but by administrators. They are built by the people who show up every day with a brush or a stamp, who ensure that grain reaches its destination, that laborers are fed, that justice is recorded. Their power was quiet, their impact enormous. And perhaps, as we drift off to sleep reflecting on these ancient workers, we might consider this. In a world obsessed with big names and bold actions, who truly holds the line between order and chaos? Is it the ruler with the crown or the scribe with the scroll? Story 3. The gnome system, dividing a divine kingdom. Imagine yourself gliding down the Nile on a reed boat sometime during the 5th dynasty. The sun glints off the slow, muddy water. The riverbanks are alive with activity, farmers tending flax and barley, children chasing goats, scribes noting the progress of irrigation ditches, and granaries in the distance storing the region's grain yield. But the most important thing you'd be crossing isn't visible. You've just passed from one gnome into another, a border not marked by a fence or wall, but by the records of an administrator with a stylus. The gnome system, the administrative division of ancient Egypt, was the unseen skeleton of the state. These gnomes' districts formed the boundaries for taxes, justice, governance, and labor. They were not just practical, they were symbolic, political, and spiritual. This is the story of how Egypt, one of the world's earliest nation-states, carved itself into manageable parts, and how those parts eventually grew into powers of their own. What is a gnome? The word gnome comes from the Greek nomos, meaning district, but the Egyptians called them sepat, and there were 42 of them in total during the later periods. 22 in Upper Egypt, the southern region. 20 in Lower Egypt, the northern delta. Each gnome had a capital city, often a hub of trade or religious significance. A governor, known later as a nomarch, who oversaw administration. A set of boundaries, often based on natural features like rivers, hills, or floodplains. A symbolic emblem, often linked to a local god or animal, such as a hare, a jackal, or a falcon. The concept of dividing land into nomes is older than writing in Egypt. Early pre-dynastic communities had already begun coalescing around geographic zones, but it was the Old Kingdom that standardized these divisions into a formal system. Why divide the kingdom? The answer is both obvious and profound. Egypt is a land defined by its river. Beyond the narrow green strip along the Nile, all is desert. And yet within that strip were thousands of communities, each producing grain, textiles, livestock, and taxes. Managing such a geography without division was impossible. The gnome system allowed centralization. The king's government could assign quotas and track outputs by gnome. Delegation. Nomarchs could resolve local disputes, collect taxes, and conscript labor. Standardization. By treating each gnome as a functional unit, scribes could create consistent reports for the vizier and pharaoh. But the gnomes were not just lines on a map. They were places of identity. A man might say he was Egyptian, but he would also say, "I am of the hare gnome," or "I am from the crocodile gnome." Each district had its own god, its own traditions, and often its own temple cult. The gnome was thus a political and religious microcosm of the kingdom. The role of the nomarch. At the top of each gnome's administrative pyramid stood the nomarch, a title meaning ruler of the gnome, though this term is also Greek in origin. In the Old Kingdom, nomarchs were appointed directly by the king or the vizier, often moved between gnomes to prevent accumulation of local loyalty. Tasked with tax collection, labor conscription, irrigation management, and local justice. The nomarch was assisted by scribes, sealbearers, overseers, and priests. His authority was vast within his gnome, but bounded by loyalty to Memphis, the capital. A well-run gnome meant grain shipments arrived on time. Pyramids had their share of laborers. Temples performed their rituals. The Nile's floodwaters were directed effectively. A failed gnome where famine, drought, or corruption set in could threaten national stability. Hence, viziers kept close watch on nomarchs. Reports were required frequently. Audits were not uncommon. And yet, over time, some gnomes became semi-hereditary. Sons succeeded fathers. Families grew wealthy. By the end of the Old Kingdom, some nomarchs had tombs rivaling royal officials, an ominous sign for any central state. Symbols and the spiritual map of Egypt. Each gnome had a heraldic symbol, used in temple art, tombs, and official seals. These were not arbitrary. They often reflected the local deity or a mythological story associated with the region. For example, the hare gnome 15th Upper Egypt featured a hare linked to the moon and cycles of rebirth. The crocodile gnome worshipped Sobek, the fearsome water god. The jackal gnome centered its worship around Anubis, god of embalming. In religious texts, the gnomes were often invoked collectively, as if they were divine limbs of the state. Certain festival calendars called on each gnome to bring specific offerings. In the Book of the Dead, the soul of the deceased journeyed through representations of the gnomes, suggesting that even in the afterlife, the administrative map still mattered. Some gnomes held great political weight due to the temples they housed. Others were trade hubs or border posts. No two were equal, but all were accounted for. Crisis at the edges, when gnomes go rogue. By the reign of Pepi II, the central government's grip began to loosen. As noted in earlier stories, this was partly due to bureaucratic overgrowth and famine, but also because the gnome system had matured into a problem. The same regional structure that once ensured order now enabled autonomy. Nomarchs stopped moving from gnome to gnome. They built local power bases, military forces to defend or raid neighboring districts, temples to glorify themselves and rival royal ones, administrative independence, often ignoring royal edicts. They even began to inscribe their own achievements, farming innovations, construction, tax reforms in tombs and monuments. One nomarch even had himself depicted the same size as the pharaoh, a break from centuries of artistic tradition, where only the king was shown at the largest scale. The result, Egypt fractured not into foreign states but into hyperlocal kingdoms. Loyalty to the pharaoh gave way to loyalty to the gnome. Lines that lasted. Despite the collapse of the central government during the First Intermediate Period, the gnome system itself did not disappear. In fact, it proved surprisingly durable. Nomarchs continued to rule their districts even without royal oversight. Religious and economic life remained tied to gnome identity. Scribes still recorded taxes, even if the recipient was a local strongman instead of the state. When the Middle Kingdom emerged, rulers like Mentuhotep II and Amenemhat I restored the central state in part by reigning in nomarchs. Some were removed, others were absorbed into the central bureaucracy. Still, the gnome system remained. For 2,000 more years, Egypt's core administrative geography would rest on these same 42 divisions. Roman rulers, centuries later, would still rely on Egyptian gnome boundaries when governing the province. This long survival was not due to perfect design, but to deep integration into daily life. The gnomes were how Egyptians understood their place in the world. A map of the mind. It is easy to think of political divisions as imposed lines, modern inventions of bureaucracy. But in Egypt, the nomes were not just practical. They were mental maps, shaping how people saw themselves, their gods, and their kingdom. Each nome had its own myths, festivals, dialects, and priesthoods. They were regional identities within a national identity. Even today, many Egyptian towns trace their heritage to ancient nome capitals. The emblems of the nomes remain in temple art, museum artifacts, and scholarly maps. These lines, drawn in the fertile silt of the Nile, shaped one of the world's oldest continuous civilizations. But what happens when identity grows stronger than loyalty? When a district sees itself not as part of a kingdom, but as its own kingdom? Can division, once useful, become the seeds of disunity? Imagine you are a farmer in a small village near the edge of the 17th nome of Upper Egypt. It is the mid-6th dynasty. You know the Nile's moods. You track the floodwaters by watching the black silt creep into your fields. And when the inundation is generous, you offer a portion of your grain to a local storehouse. But who do you offer it to? Once the answer would have been simple: the pharaoh, through his vizier, through the temple priest, through the scribe who walks the fields with his stylus and ledger. But now, more and more, the man collecting your grain wears the insignia of your own nomarch, not the crown of unified Egypt, not the seal of Memphis, just the emblem of your district, a jackal perhaps, or a crocodile. It is a small change. But small changes, when repeated across 42 nomes and hundreds of years, reshape the state. The hereditary shift. In the early Old Kingdom, nomarchs were appointed. The king, acting through the vizier, selected trusted administrators from among the bureaucratic elite. These men served at the pleasure of the crown, and they were rotated or recalled at will. This system worked until the mid-5th to 6th dynasties, when appointments quietly became hereditary. Tomb inscriptions from this period begin to show a new pattern. I am the son of the honored nomarch Seneb. He taught me the ways of rule. The nome obeyed me as it obeyed him. In these lines is a subtle but dramatic shift in authority. No longer derived from the king, the right to rule came from lineage from the land itself. Sons inherited districts like estates. Entire families embedded themselves into the religious and economic structures of their nomes. By the reign of Pepi I, there were multi-generational dynasties of nomarchs ruling regional territories. They were still expected to pay taxes and deliver labor to royal projects, but their day-to-day operations were independent. This had clear advantages: stability in administration, long-term investment in local infrastructure, efficient governance tuned to local needs. But it also had one obvious, destabilizing risk: fragmentation of national identity. The rise of monumental nomarch tombs. In earlier dynasties, tombs were concentrated in Memphis and its nearby necropolis Saqqara, Giza, Abusir. These were the burial places of kings, viziers, and top officials close to the capital. But as nomarchs grew more powerful, they began to construct grand tombs within their own nomes, particularly along the Nile Valley cliffs of Upper Egypt. Take Beni Hassan, the necropolis of the 16th nome. Here, cliffside tombs carved deep into the limestone reveal massive pillared halls, colorful frescoes, and autobiographical inscriptions celebrating local rule. These texts don't glorify the king, they glorify the nomarch, his irrigation projects, his judgments in disputes, his grain management during famines, his construction of temples and granaries, his leadership in local militias or expeditions. They paint a picture not of subordinates, but of sovereign administrators. By writing their deeds in stone, nomarchs claimed permanence, just as kings once had. Some even styled themselves as beloved of the gods, a phrase previously reserved for pharaohs. This tomb culture became a public message: the state may be distant, but here I rule. temples and local cults, the religious dimension of autonomy. Religion, too, played a role in gnome autonomy. Every gnome had its local deity, often a lesser god with a specific tie to the land, the Nile, or a regional myth. While national temples worshipped Ra, Osiris, or Horus, local temples honored gods like Gnome, the ram-headed god of pottery and creation, worshipped in the first gnome. Min, god of fertility, worshipped in the ninth Upper Egyptian gnome. Wepwat, the opener of the ways, worshipped in the jackal gnome alongside Anubis. As nomarchs grew wealthier, they lavished donations on their local temples not just out of piety, but to solidify legitimacy. Temples became hubs of administration. Priests recorded offerings, managed labor, and stored grain. Nomarchs would often serve as high priest of local god, cementing control over both secular and sacred spheres. The result was a religious political echo chamber. Temples praised the nomarch. The nomarch funded temples. The population followed local rituals and myths, increasingly divorced from state ideology. This fragmentation of worship mirrored the fragmentation of power. Military power at the district level. Another worrying development was the militarization of gnomes. With the decline of central power, nomarchs began raising their own. Militias to defend against border raids. Guards to escort shipments. Scouting parties for expeditions into the desert. Some tomb inscriptions detail local military campaigns such as defending against Libyan raiders or skirmishes over water rights with neighboring gnomes. These were once duties of the pharaoh's army. Now, nomarchs led their own battles. This autonomy was double-edged. In times of chaos, it provided localized security, but it also undermined national unity. As nomarchs wielded arms, taxation, and temple authority, they became de facto kings within their districts. Signals of decline, overlapping authority and competing loyalties. As power shifted toward gnomes, the central government tried to reassert control sometimes by creating overlapping jurisdictions. Assigning two officials to manage the same gnome, one hereditary, one appointed. Using royal auditors to review tax collection, often ignored. Creating honorary titles to reward loyalty and dilute hereditary power. But these efforts were too little, too late. In some gnomes, local elites ignored royal decrees. In others, they sent only partial taxes, claiming flood damage or theft. In extreme cases, nomarchs stopped acknowledging the king altogether, instead forging alliances with neighbors, like petty kings forming a patchwork of semi-states. Scribes continued to write, seals continued to stamp, but the chain of command was broken. When the center cannot hold. By the very end of the 6th dynasty, the pharaoh's role had become largely ceremonial. Tomb inscriptions of provincial elites mention donations to local gods, construction of granaries and irrigation systems, adjudication of disputes, patronage of scribes and artists. But rarely do they mention direct orders from Memphis. The gnome system, designed to organize a divine kingdom, had become a web of independent principalities. And yet, remarkably, the system itself did not collapse. Each gnome still functioned, farmers planted, taxes now local were collected, temples performed their rites, bureaucrats recorded grain and land. What fell was the idea of Egypt as a singular state. A quiet fragmentation. The first intermediate period, 2181–2055 BCE, was not a time of fire and ruin. It was a time of quiet fragmentation. The great machine of the Old Kingdom didn't shatter, it dissolved, gnome by gnome. The pharaoh no longer sent orders. The vizier's ledger was ignored. Memphis faded. In its place rose the geography of survival districts led by men who knew their land, protected their people, and honored their local gods. In many ways, this period was a triumph of local governance, but it came at the cost of national cohesion. So we are left to ask, can a kingdom divided into perfect, manageable parts ever truly hold together? Or is division, once too successful, the very thing that dooms unity? It is the year 2060 BCE. A man named Mentuhotep II, ruler of a city far to the south, Thebes, has just taken a final step to declare himself not just a regional king, but the true pharaoh of a reunified Egypt. It has been over a century since a single ruler held sway over all 42 nomes. The map has not changed, the nomes are still there, but something deeper has shifted. The idea of a united Egypt has returned. This final section of the story explores how the gnome system, born in the Old Kingdom and fractured in the First Intermediate Period, did not vanish but rather shaped the rebirth of the Egyptian state again and again. It became more than a tool of bureaucracy. It became the framework for Egyptian civilization's survival and restoration. The First Intermediate Period, life between kingdoms. The First Intermediate Period, 2181–2055 BCE, is often described as a time of decline. But that label is misleading. It was not an age of anarchy. Rather, it was an age of local governance. Each nome functioned like a small kingdom. Nomarchs maintained control, oversaw temples, managed local agriculture, and even led public works. Inscriptions from this period show thriving nomes. I fed my people in time of flood. I opened the storehouses when others closed theirs. I built walls to keep out the sand. These aren't records of national campaigns or grand monuments. They are records of survival. The state was gone, but society adapted. The problem wasn't that gnomes failed. The problem was that they no longer saw a reason to cooperate. Egypt had become a confederation without a core. Thebes rises. A nome becomes a capital. The city of Thebes, located in the fourth nome of Upper Egypt, began as just another provincial center. But its rulers, especially the Intef and Mentuhotep dynasties, began asserting broader authority. Their strategy was clear: military conquest of neighboring nomes, pushing northward; religious unification, promoting Amun, the Theban god, as a national deity; bureaucratic revival, restoring viziers, scribes, and sealbearers under centralized command. When Mentuhotep II finally overcame his northern rivals and declared himself pharaoh of all Egypt, he didn't dismantle the nome system. Instead, he co-opted it. He allowed local elites to retain power if they swore allegiance. He reappointed some hereditary nomarchs. He rewarded others with titles and grain quotas. Most importantly, he recentered administration. Nomes once again reported to Memphis and later Thebes. National festivals returned. Temple offerings resumed. The bureaucracy was back. The nome system had survived not by resisting change, but by absorbing it. The nome system in the Middle Kingdom, reformed, not removed. Under the 12th dynasty, especially the reign of Amenemhat I and Senusret I, the central government began to strategically weaken hereditary nomarch power. This was done not by abolishing nomes, but by installing royal officials parallel to existing nomarchs, often with overlapping authority; creating new administrative districts within nomes, especially in key economic regions; encouraging the building of royal temples in nome capitals, reasserting pharaonic presence; promoting merit-based bureaucrats, trained in scribal schools and loyal to the crown. The Middle Kingdom even saw the emergence of resident governors, who reported directly to the vizier and traveled between nomes, acting as roving auditors. Yet the nomes themselves remained. Their boundaries, symbols, and identities endured. Even as the state sought tighter control, it relied on the nome system to do it. Nomes as economic and religious engines. As the Middle Kingdom progressed, gnomes became more integrated into economic and religious networks. Regional granaries served as tax centers. Gnomes near the Red Sea or Western Desert acted as launch points for mining expeditions. Nile-based gnomes coordinated massive irrigation projects. Local temples maintained scribal archives, some of which survive today. Each gnome had a specific function in the larger whole. Some produced papyrus, others cattle, others stone. The state didn't attempt to make every district the same, it leveraged local expertise. This decentralized specialization made Egypt resilient. If one gnome faced drought, another could provide aid. If one temple's archives were lost, another preserved the necessary records. The system was not perfect, but it was durable. Later echoes, gnomes in the New Kingdom and beyond. By the New Kingdom, 1550–1070 BCE, the pharaohs ruled over an empire that stretched beyond Egypt's traditional borders. Yet the gnome system persisted, especially in domestic affairs. Officials still carried titles like Overseer of the 14th Gnome of Upper Egypt, Chief Priest of the Ram God in the 6th Gnome, Scribe of the Crocodile Gnome Treasury. The gnomes appeared in tax rolls, judicial scrolls, temple donation records, military drafts. Even when new capitals rose, Thebes, Akhetaten, Pyramuses, and new gods like Aten or Amun took prominence, the gnomes remained administrative constants. They were no longer sources of rebellion, they were tools of integration. The gnome system under foreign rule. As Egypt fell under foreign control, first the Libyans, then the Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, and finally the Romans, the gnome system was not abolished. Each occupying power recognized its utility. The Greeks renamed many gnomes and integrated them into their city-state model, but maintained their boundaries. The Romans used gnomes for census taking and tax enforcement, inserting imperial governors while leaving local structures intact. This endurance across over 2,500 years marks the gnome system as one of the most successful administrative models in human history. No written constitution, no armies defending its borders, just names, symbols, and traditions passed from one generation to the next. Why the gnome system worked? The gnome system worked because it was geographically logical. Boundaries followed natural features. Flexible, power could shift without breaking the structure. Deeply embedded, religious, economic, and cultural identities were linked to gnomes. Legible to the state, central officials could quickly grasp regional outputs and issues. Accepted by the people, gnomes were not abstractions, they were homes. In modern terms, the gnome system resembled a federalist map, without a formal constitution, a balance of local and central authority, continuously negotiated, sometimes strained, but rarely broken. A lesson from the past. Looking back across the centuries, we see in the gnome system a lesson not just about bureaucracy, but about human adaptation. Civilizations often rise through centralization, but survive through decentralization. Egypt's greatness was not only in its pyramids or pharaohs, but in its ability to divide power without losing cohesion, at least for a time. The gnomes enabled resilience, regional pride, and practical governance. And though they sometimes seeded disunity, they also carried the torch of Egyptian identity when larger institutions failed. So in the end, we might ask, is it better for a state to be centralized and strong or regional and enduring? Can a nation survive through its parts when its whole disappears? Story 4. Bureaucracy by the Nile. Taxation, grain, and quiet control. You are standing at the edge of a dusty courtyard in the shadow of a half-finished pyramid. The air smells of sweat, crushed limestone, and something dry and earthy grain. A steady line of men moves forward, baskets balanced on shoulders, scrolls in hand, a chorus of murmured totals and measured complaints drifting upward into the morning air. You're not in a marketplace. You're in the granary yard of a royal tax office during the Old Kingdom. There are no coins in sight, no piles of gold or barter tables. The men unloading baskets aren't paying tribute in silver or silk. They're paying in grain, the true currency of ancient Egypt. This is not the glamorous part of history. This is not battles or royal tombs. But in the quiet world of taxation, bureaucracy, and grain accounting, Egypt's real power was built and preserved. This is where survival happened. Grain, the currency of a civilization. In the Old Kingdom, money did not exist in the form we know it today. There were no minted coins. Precious metals were used primarily in religious or ornamental contexts, not for daily exchange. Grain was the base of the economic pyramid. Wages were paid in grain. Taxes were collected in grain. Temples received offerings in grain. Grain stored during good harvests could feed workers during pyramid construction or famine years. This wasn't simply practical, it was deeply strategic. The Nile's annual inundation provided the rhythm of the agricultural year. After the waters receded, they left behind fertile black silt, ideal for planting. Crops were grown, harvested, bundled, and taxed. Taxation rates varied but were commonly between 10–20% of the harvest. In years of abundance, more could be demanded. In lean years, exceptions were made but not often. The bureaucracy was as consistent as it was unyielding. The result? A state grain reserve that could fund enormous public projects, support officials, provision temples, and when necessary stave off famine. It wasn't just taxation, it was a controlled system of survival. The mechanics of tax collection. The process was meticulous, often slow, occasionally painful, and almost always recorded. Surveyors measured each plot of land, recording its size, crop, and productivity. These measurements were done using cords, rods, and a practiced eye. Scribes calculated expected yields and tax obligations. These records were stored in the house of life, scriptoria, associated with temples or royal offices. Collectors arrived post-harvest, often with guards or overseers, to collect the grain owed. The grain was then weighed and recorded by another set of scribes, sealed by a local seal-bearer, stored in mud-brick granaries, raised above ground to reduce rot. This was not a one-off event. Every harvest season, across dozens of gnomes, hundreds of tax officials repeated the process. Each record was reviewed by the vizier's office, then filed for future reference. A discrepancy could trigger an investigation. A missing quota could result in penalties or worse. But a surplus, that meant favor, recognition, perhaps even a promotion. The human side of the ledger. These procedures weren't faceless. For every tax demanded, there was a farmer with a family. For every record written, a scribe with an aching wrist. For every seal applied, a man responsible for the accuracy of the weight inside. Some citizens resisted taxation, hiding grain, lying about yields, delaying delivery. Others overpaid intentionally, hopping for favor or protection during lean years. There are records from later periods that reflect long-standing frustrations. The collector arrived before the sickle touched the field. Anonymous peasant complaint, Middle Kingdom text, reflecting earlier customs. Sometimes officials were corrupt, taking bribes or underreporting harvests in exchange for personal gain. Such actions were risky, but so was starvation. For the ordinary Egyptian, taxation was not an abstract civic duty. It was a yearly negotiation with the gods, the land, and the bureaucracy. The role of temples in grain economy. Temples were not just spiritual centers, they were economic engines. Many were granted large tracts of land by the pharaoh or wealthy nomarchs. These temple estates were cultivated by tenant farmers and laborers, and their harvests were partially directed toward temple granaries. In return, temples supplied food to priests and religious personnel, fed the poor and travelers as part of religious duty, maintained emergency grain stores for famine periods, funded temple construction and festivals. Temple scribes worked alongside state scribes. Sometimes their records overlapped. Other times, they conflicted, particularly during periods of political instability. But both state and temple bureaucracies treated grain as sacred, not just because it fed people, but because it sustained cosmic order. The dual economy, grain and everything else. While grain was king, it wasn't the only taxed commodity. Egypt's bureaucracy tracked livestock, cattle, sheep, goats, often tallied in periodic censuses. Textiles, especially linen, which served as clothing and wrapping for the dead. Beer and bread, produced in temple workshops and taxed as part of festival preparations. Labor, in lieu of goods, some citizens owed periods of state service in construction, quarrying, or transport. Still, grain formed the bedrock. Other goods were measured against grain, using it as a unit of account. It served the same purpose as currency: standardized value, store of wealth, and medium of exchange. Thus, tax collectors became arbiters of fairness and agents of central power. Where the grain went, storage and redistribution. Once collected, grain flowed into the state's centralized storage system. Memphis and key gnomes housed massive granary complexes. Grain was stored in mud-brick silos, designed to minimize spoilage. Rotating inventories were maintained. Fresh grain replaced old stock to prevent loss. During drought or food shortage, grain was released by decree, often publicly accompanied by ritual offerings to appease the gods. This system allowed the state to feed laborers on royal projects without drawing on local resources, support the army in times of conflict, sustain temples, ensuring the continuity of religious rituals, weather bad harvests without social collapse. In theory, it was the closest thing the ancient world had to strategic reserves. But like any system, it depended on trust in the scribes, in the seal-bearers, in the overseers, and in the honesty of reports. When that trust eroded, the system faltered. Taxation and legitimacy. Pharaohs did not justify their rule through conquest alone. They also did it through control of grain. Each successful harvest season recorded, taxed, stored, and redistributed reaffirmed the king's role as the maintainer of the divine order of balance, justice, and harmony. Without taxation, the state had no temple festivals, no public works, no food for workers. And without those things, the divinity of the king was questioned. Thus, taxation wasn't just about sustenance. It was spiritual legitimacy, quiet, methodical, and vital. Early signs of breakdown. Even in the late Old Kingdom, cracks began to show. In some gnomes, grain quotas were unmet, blamed on floods, pests, or laziness. Some scribes were accused of padding numbers to meet expectations. Seal duplication became a growing problem, especially as regional powers expanded. Nomarchs began to redirect grain locally, especially in Upper Egypt. Temples, too, sometimes kept more than they reported. And while the granaries remained full in Memphis for a time, the system was already becoming too large, too slow, and too dependent on ideal conditions. So what happens when a flood fails, a scribe lies, and the granary door stays shut? If grain is life, what is left when it vanishes from the ledgers? The granary still stood tall, sun-baked, and quiet, but inside the silence had grown heavier. The clay seal on the grain door was unbroken, but the whispers outside the walls were growing louder. A failed harvest, a missed shipment, a scribe too afraid to record the truth. In ancient Egypt, grain was more than food. It was the assurance of order, a measurement of the king's righteousness. the material expression of the cosmic balance. But what happens when that grain begins to vanish? By the late 6th dynasty, the carefully crafted machinery of taxation and redistribution began to strain, bend, and falter. The bureaucracy had not disappeared, but it could no longer respond effectively to crisis. A system designed for stability, not shock. The Old Kingdom's tax and grain systems worked under one assumption: that the Nile would always rise and that people would always comply. Indeed, for generations this assumption held. The Nile flooded predictably. The soil remained fertile. The people accepted their obligations. The scribes recorded, the seal-bearers confirmed, and the granaries filled. But the system was not designed for unpredictability. Around the end of the 6th dynasty, a series of unusually low Nile floods struck Egypt. These weren't cataclysms, but they were persistent. Crop yields dropped. Farmers could barely feed themselves, let alone pay taxes. The bureaucracy, however, remained inflexible. Tax quotas did not adjust in time. Collectors came anyway. In some areas, entire villages abandoned their fields, choosing flight over famine or punishment. Others bribed local scribes to underreport harvests. Grain that once flowed upward to central storage was now rerouted into local caches, hidden behind temple walls or stored in sealed private granaries guarded by hired men. A system designed for control and efficiency found itself suffocated by its own expectations. The burden of bureaucracy. The Egyptian state responded to shortfalls not by loosening control, but by increasing oversight. More scribes were dispatched to failing regions. Seal protocols were tightened. New inspectors were appointed to audit older officials. In theory, this should have helped. In practice, it added pressure to an already overwhelmed system. Nomarchs, now semi-autonomous, began to resist intervention. Some refused inspectors outright. Others falsified records to avoid reprimand. In a few cases, inspectors sent from Memphis simply disappeared, lost, ignored, or worse. The more the central state pushed, the more local power resisted. Egypt's taxation bureaucracy, so effective during times of surplus, now amplified the chaos during deficit. The collapse of the feedback loop. A critical part of any administrative system is the flow of information. Reports must travel. Corrections must be issued. Orders must be followed. This creates a feedback loop, a way for the state to adjust policy in response to reality. But as grain disappeared and scribes were pressured to meet expectations, this loop began to break. Reports were falsified to avoid punishment. Delays in communication made real-time decisions impossible. Contradictory orders from the vizier's office sowed confusion. Duplicated seals created doubt about the authenticity of transactions. Even when accurate reports were made, there was often no capacity to act on them. Central reserves had dwindled. Laborers abandoned projects to return home. Nomarchs hoarded grain for their own people. The bureaucracy still existed, but its decisions no longer aligned with conditions on the ground. Stories in the dust, evidence of disintegration. Most of the records from this period are fragmentary, but even in their dryness, they hint at a system under stress. Inscriptions from tombs and temple walls begin to include phrases like, "He opened the storehouses when others closed them. He fed the hungry when the Nile gave little. He judged fairly when many turned away the poor." These inscriptions were not idle boasts. They were moral defenses, justifications for elite survival in a time when many suffered. They also show a shift in responsibility. Once, only the pharaoh was praised for abundance. Now, individual local leaders claimed credit for relief. The national narrative had fractured into regional responses. Even in the instructions of Merecare, a wisdom text from the first intermediate period, a king advises his son, "Do not rely on the flood alone. The wise ruler plans for famine, stores grain, and guards his scribes well. This is the voice of a world where bureaucracy has already failed once, and memory has recorded the price. Grain riots and the First Intermediate Period. There is no definitive record of a grain riot in the Old Kingdom, but by the early First Intermediate Period, texts begin to reflect civil unrest linked to hunger. The most famous is the Admonitions of Ipuwer, a poetic lament possibly fictionalized but resonant. Behold, the storehouse is empty. He who once owned grain is now in rags. The officials are slain, and the records burned. Whether literal or metaphorical, it tells of a world inverting. The guardians of grain, scribes, taxmen, bureaucrats, no longer serve the people. In many accounts, they were the first to be blamed when food ran out. The very system that once ensured prosperity had become, in the eyes of many, an engine of suffering. Local granaries, local loyalties. In the absence of a functional central system, gnomes increasingly turned to their own leadership. Nomarchs seized control of regional granaries. Temples withheld grain from the state and distributed it locally. Village councils formed to ration supplies. Some regions did better than others. Inscriptions from Middle Egypt often show organized relief efforts, while others, especially in the Delta, report famine, flight, and depopulation. This decentralization was not just political, it was pragmatic. If a nomarch could feed his people, he was a king in all but name. The death of a scribe. There is no famous tomb that records the moment when the last honest scribe of the Old Kingdom put down his pen. But the decline of administrative authority is evident in the degradation of record-keeping itself. Scrolls go unupdated. Granary inventories stop mid-column. Dates become ambiguous or vanish altogether. New scribes appear without clear titles or jurisdictions. As fewer people trusted the records, fewer people maintained them. This is how a bureaucratic collapse begins, not in fire, but in neglect and silence. Some scribes no doubt survived, turning to temples or private estates. Others became wandering clerks, offering their skills for food or shelter. A few may have buried their pallets, knowing the state they served would not rise again in their lifetime. Was the system to blame? It's tempting to blame the Old Kingdom's bureaucracy for its own collapse, but that would miss the point. The system worked exceptionally well under the right conditions. When the Nile flooded as expected. When labor was abundant. When communication flowed. When trust in central authority was strong. What broke it was not design but rigidity. It could not adapt fast enough. It could not redistribute power or expectation. It could not listen when its scribes began to lie, not from malice but from fear. The lesson is not that bureaucracy fails, but that it must bend before it breaks. So we ask, can a state survive without trust in its ledgers? When the seal is no longer sacred and the grain goes uncounted, what is left of a civilization? The sun rises once more over the Nile, casting long golden streaks across abandoned fields and quiet villages. The granaries remain, some sealed and full, others broken into, their contents scattered. In the royal palace at Memphis, the offices of scribes sit empty, clay tablets half inscribed, seals unpressed. The machine of bureaucracy, once the quiet power behind the pharaoh's might, has slowed to a whisper. But not silence. Even in the wake of the Old Kingdom's collapse, Egypt's bureaucratic mind, the systems that measured, taxed, stored, and planned, did not die. It waited. It adapted. And when the Middle Kingdom rose from the ruins, it would be bureaucracy, not war, that held Egypt together once again. This final section examines the aftermath of collapse, the reconstruction of bureaucratic trust, and the lessons carried forward from Egypt's early experiments in taxation and control. The broken chain, consequences of collapse. As central authority crumbled in the First Intermediate Period, so too did the consistency of taxation. Records diverged. Local scribes created new forms and formulas. Granary management became hyper-localized, often under temple control. Standard weights and measures were ignored or altered. Seals were forged, lost, or deemed irrelevant. Without a unified bureaucracy, confidence in documentation eroded. People no longer believed that a tax paid in one gnome would be recognized in another. Labor records went unchecked. Temple obligations became voluntary. It was not chaos, it was disconnection. The very tools that once bound Egypt into a single organism had been cut from their center. Yet the practices, the habits of record-keeping, the culture of accounting, the value of grain as currency never disappeared. In the ashes of collapse, the bureaucracy left behind a powerful idea. To govern is to organize, and to organize is to write. The Middle Kingdom, bureaucracy reborn. With the rise of the Middle Kingdom, particularly under the 12th dynasty, Egypt's rulers sought not just to rebuild, but to reassert control over the structures that had failed. But they didn't start from scratch. They examined the ruins of the Old Kingdom and asked the essential question: how can we make the machine work again, but better? Hear how they answered. Professionalization of officials. Scribes and tax officials were no longer appointed purely by lineage. Training schools emerged, teaching not just writing, but accounting, auditing, and protocol. Manuals from the period show a shift from ritual to regulation. Standardized record-keeping. New forms were introduced. Duplicate entries were mandated. Seals were cataloged. A missing record became a punishable offense. Granary oversight. Central and local granaries were now audited regularly by royal inspectors. Some grain was stored regionally, but marked for state redistribution, maintaining flexibility without losing oversight. Layered bureaucracy. Positions such as overseer of the two granaries, scribe of the royal table, and registrar of cattle appeared. Authority was spread, no single official controlled too much. Appeals system. For the first time, some records indicate avenues for appeal in cases of tax overreach or administrative error. This created a feedback mechanism previously lacking. The Middle Kingdom bureaucracy was still heavy, but it was now responsive, modular, and less brittle. The cultural memory of collapse. The trauma of the Old Kingdom's end left a deep imprint on Egyptian political culture. Middle Kingdom texts often carry a defensive tone, seeking to reassure readers that order has been restored, and the state remembers. For example, the instructions of Amenemhat I, supposedly written by the king for his son, warns: the people forget quickly. Let them see that the land is counted, the grain measured, the men taxed according to justice. In this we see a philosophy of rulership through administration. Not glory, not warfare, but fair accounting. The king becomes not just the master of war and ritual, but the chief bureaucrat, the keeper of accurate ledgers. Even gods like Thoth, once associated mainly with wisdom and writing, become patrons of record-keeping and balance. The afterlife of the grain book. The grain accounts of the Old Kingdom may have fallen into disuse, but their methods survived. Labor conscription in the Middle Kingdom was again recorded in grain equivalents. Offerings to temples were listed in bushels, oxen and linen tied to harvest projections. Temple endowments were measured not by area alone, but by expected grain yield, reinforcing productivity as the basis of legitimacy. Even in tomb inscriptions, Middle Kingdom officials began listing their audits, the number of sealed documents they processed, and the volumes of grain they managed as points of pride. In one remarkable tomb from this period, the owner proclaims, "I did not let the grain rot. I turned no widow away. I falsified no weight. I counted for the king as I counted for the gods." Here, moral virtue and bureaucratic excellence merge. The good man is the honest record-keeper, enduring lessons in quiet power. By the time Egypt entered the New Kingdom, its bureaucracy had become a vast, layered institution, capable of running an empire. It was not perfect, but it was more resilient than its old kingdom ancestor. And yet, the legacy of early failure haunted every new dynasty. Redundant checks were seen not as inefficiency, but as wisdom. Regional autonomy was balanced with state redistribution. Record-keeping was elevated to a sacred art, essential to both state and soul. In the Temple of Karnak, one priest-inscribed tablet reads, "What is not written is as if it never was. What is written is eternal." The memory of a failed bureaucracy had taught Egypt a hard lesson. Control is not strength unless it adapts. Authority is not truth unless it is verified. Echoes in modern governance. The bureaucratic principles of ancient Egypt still echo in modern institutions. The use of record-based taxation. The need for data integrity and auditing. The balance of local autonomy with central oversight. The danger of systems too rigid to respond to crisis. While the materials have changed from clay tablets to spreadsheets, the essential dynamics remain. What Egypt built along the Nile was more than a kingdom. It was one of the first great experiments in sustainable governance through meticulous, often boring, but profoundly important documentation. And it reminds us that civilizations are not held together by monuments or armies alone. They are held together by the people who count the grain, verify the seals, and quietly keep the machine running. So as we close the ledgers of this story, we might ask, is bureaucracy the death of freedom or its guarantee? Is control cold or does it preserve warmth through crisis, if applied with care? Story 5. Stone and Order, Managing Pyramid Construction. The pyramids rise in the desert as if they've always been there, timeless, immutable, eternal. But nothing eternal is built without effort. Behind the myth of divine kingship and the illusion of miraculous construction lies something far more human: administration. Stone was carved, transported, and placed. Laborers were housed, fed, and paid. Quotas were calculated. Deadlines were issued. Complaints were logged. You do not build a 2.5 million stone monument with willpower or faith alone. You build it with ledgers, logistics, and leadership. This is the story of how the Egyptian Old Kingdom managed its greatest construction feat not through slaves or divine magic, but through bureaucratic precision and human organization on a scale previously unseen in human history. The myth of slave labor. Let us begin by discarding a common misunderstanding. The pyramids were not built by slaves. This idea, long embedded in popular culture, has been thoroughly refuted by archaeology. Worker cemeteries near Giza show honorable burials, not mass graves. Remains show diets of meat, fish, and bread indicative of valued labor, not chattel. Names of worker groups include phrases like Friends of Khufu and Enduring Gang, suggesting camaraderie and state identity. Laborers were often conscripted during the flood season, when farms lay submerged. This made economic sense. You took idle hands and put them to work on public projects, a win-win for the state and its citizens, though likely not without hardship. These workers were organized into units, overseen by scribes, provided food and housing, and rotated regularly. They were essentially seasonal state employees. And managing them required something far more powerful than whips: administrative structure. Where it all began: quarries and resources. Before a single stone was placed, it had to be located. Surveyors and geologists identified suitable limestone, granite, or basalt. Approved. Royal overseers and scribes logged the quarry's dimensions and expected yield. Excavated. Stonecutters, often skilled workers, chiseled blocks, smoothed faces, and tagged them for shipping. Quarry sites like Tura limestone and Aswan granite were massive logistical centers. They included tool workshops, labor housing, granaries and bakeries, scribe stations to track output. The stones were marked with red ochre or charcoal, often with notations like "for the Pyramid of Khufu" or "Team Ra-Strong." These markings ensured traceability. Once cut, stones were transported via sledges, dragged across the desert or rolled onto boats during high Nile flood. None of this happened casually. Every movement of stone was scheduled, weighed, recorded, confirmed by seal. It was not a triumph of muscle. It was a triumph of organization. The pyramid workforce, bureaucracy in motion. The construction site was a city unto itself. At Giza, tens of thousands of laborers lived in a purpose-built settlement just south of the pyramids. Archaeology shows bakeries capable of producing thousands of loaves daily. Cattle bones suggesting large-scale meat provisioning. Pottery linked to Upper and Lower Egypt, showing wide-scale distribution networks. The workers were organized into teams, each with a foreman, a scribe, a quartermaster, a logistics overseer. Team names were painted on blocks. Some gangs developed reputations for speed or precision. But make no mistake, this was not a disorganized labor camp. It was a machine of human effort fueled by daily rations of bread and beer, rotating shifts, carefully tallied quotas. Every team's performance was monitored. Records were submitted to central overseers, who reviewed progress, adjusted schedules, and resolved shortages. Construction was not the work of kings, it was the work of clerks. Food and fuel, feeding the pyramid. Grain, again, formed the backbone of this system. The labor force could not build unless it was fed, housed, kept healthy. Deliveries of grain, meat, vegetables, and beer were tracked through papyrus records and stone tallies. Supply scribes recorded daily rations per worker, weekly flour and beer stock levels, breakage reports for tools and containers. One surviving record, called the Height El Ghurab papyri, found near Giza, describes the delivery of cattle, fish, and bread to pyramid workers, along with labor rotations and river transport logs. This was a logistical miracle not unlike provisioning a small army every day for decades. Without food, the pyramid stopped, and so provisioning became as sacred as architecture. Time and measurement. Timing was everything. Pyramid projects were planned years in advance. The construction period of a large pyramid could exceed 2 decades and had to fit within the lifespan of a single pharaoh. To keep pace, planners created construction calendars, labor duty rosters, seasonal benchmarks. Progress was measured by courses, layers of stone. A team might be expected to complete a certain number of courses in a season. Missing the quota could trigger scribe audits, redistribution of resources, punishment or demotion for overseers. Work moved in rhythms based not only on available labor, but on the Nile's flood cycle, which controlled both agriculture and transport. Thus, timekeeping, surveying, and logistics management were just as critical as engineering. The overseers and their pyramid tombs. The highest officials at pyramid sites, often titled Overseer of Works, Director of the Pyramid Town, or Scribe of the King's Monument, were not anonymous. They were elite bureaucrats, some related to the royal family, others promoted from the scribe class. Their tombs near the king record labor statistics, construction benchmarks, inventory totals. One overseer proudly inscribed, "I directed the building of the king's horizon. Not one stone was misplaced. I caused no man to hunger. I falsified no weight." Such inscriptions were professional resumes, carved in stone to outlive their authors. To these men, the pyramid was not a monument to vanity. It was a life's work in stone and schedule. Mistakes and adjustments. Despite careful planning, errors occurred. Some pyramids changed mid-construction. The bent pyramid at Dashur shows an angle adjustment possibly due to instability. The Meidum pyramid collapsed in antiquity, likely due to miscalculated foundations. Corrections were made in real time. Scribes redrew plans. Surveyors remeasured alignments. Stonemasons revised angles and courses. These mistakes didn't doom the project. They showcased flexibility within the administrative structure. Failure wasn't punished with execution. It was mitigated through documentation and adaptation. The completion ritual. When a pyramid neared completion, the state conducted a grand dedication ceremony. Offerings were made. The royal cult was inaugurated. Storage magazines were stocked for priests who would maintain rituals for eternity. Behind the priests stood the final team of scribes, whose job was to catalog the inventory of temple goods, record the final labor lists, file completion documents for royal archives. Once again, the pen had the last word. The pyramid was done not when the final stone was placed, but when the final scroll was sealed. So we must ask, how does something eternal get built? Through vision or through record-keeping? Is it the pharaoh's will or the quiet hands of those who measured, counted, and adjusted each day? At the base of the Great Pyramids, hidden beneath centuries of shifting sands, lies another kind of monument less visible, but just as critical. It was not made of polished limestone or royal inscriptions, but of mud brick houses, bakeries, breweries, and barracks. This was the Pyramid City, a carefully constructed, state-managed urban complex designed to support and sustain the thousands of workers needed to complete Egypt's most iconic structures. Long before the world asked how the pyramids were built, the Egyptians had already answered a different, more important question. Where will the builders live, and how will they be fed? This section explores the structure, management, and daily rhythms of these forgotten cities where order, not glamour, made immortality possible. A planned city, not a random camp. Modern excavations at Giza, particularly at the Height El Ghureb site, have revealed an intricate and highly organized urban space dating to the reign of Khafre, builder of the second pyramid at Giza. This was not a ramshackle encampment. It was a purpose-built city, constructed by the state to serve one function: sustain and manage pyramid workers. Key features included rows of long galleries, likely sleeping quarters capable of housing hundreds, bakeries with industrial-scale ovens, capable of producing thousands of loaves per day, fish and meat processing areas for regular protein provisioning, central storage magazines, sealed with administrative marks tracking supplies, administrative offices, with papyri, seal impressions, and scribe palettes. The city was laid out in zones: residential, industrial, storage, and administrative, mirroring modern urban planning. It even had a rudimentary road system, with cart tracks and staging areas. It was not a place of glory, but a triumph of logistics. The scribes of the city. The smooth operation of a pyramid city rested not on the strength of its workers, but on the pens of its scribes. Within the city, scribes served a wide array of bureaucratic functions. Daily attendance logs, marking which workers reported for duty. Ration tallies, calculating beer and bread per man per day. Tool inventories, tracking chisels, hammers, copper blades, and sledges. Medical records, noting injuries and work stoppages. Quotas, measuring the rate of stone setting by team and sector. One remarkable find near Giza is a set of papyri detailing shipments of food supplies, including precise counts of livestock, flour, and fish brought in from outlying farms. These were not vague notes. They were surgical records of logistics designed for precision, accountability, and control. Each papyrus fragment was part of a living system of bureaucracy, updated daily, reviewed by supervisors, and sometimes filed for archival record. The scribes didn't build the pyramid, but they made sure the builders could. Hierarchy in the labor force. The labor force itself was highly stratified. Skilled artisans. These included stonemasons, surveyors, and sculptors, often permanent employees of the state. They lived in more permanent homes, enjoyed better rations, and sometimes received scarab seals or tombs as rewards. Rotational laborers. Peasant workers conscripted from across Egypt during the Nile flood. They typically served in 3-month shifts, returning to farming once the waters receded. They were housed in galleries or dormitories. Support staff. Bakers, brewers, potters, and porters essential to the city's function. These roles may have been filled by women and children, based on evidence of diverse skeletal remains and household tools. Supervisors and overseers. Appointed from the scribe class, often with ties to local temples or nomarch offices. They wore special insignia and sometimes lived apart in better accommodations. This stratification allowed the state to maintain discipline, track performance, and adjust workloads. Work crews were organized into gangs of 10 to 20, with subunits known as files. A typical team might be the followers of Khufu, reporting to a chief foreman, who in turn reported to a project overseer. Each level had its own records, reports, and review schedules. Health and welfare systems. A surprising aspect of pyramid cities is the presence of organized medical care. Skeletal remains show signs of healed fractures, indicating long-term care and survival after injury. Surgical procedures, including trepanation and dental work. Nutritional diseases, managed with surprisingly good outcomes for the period. Tools and amulets suggest the existence of healers or medics, possibly working under temple authority. Their roles would have been vital. Treating work injuries, preventing epidemics, maintaining workforce productivity. Workers were not discarded when injured. They were patched, healed, and returned. In some cases, injured workers appear to have taken up administrative or support roles, rather than being cast out. This reveals a humane practicality behind the operation rooted in labor value, not sentiment. Food supply chains. Feeding a pyramid workforce required a statewide supply network. Grain was taxed in rural gnomes and sent via boat to construction sites. Fish and cattle came from royal estates and were documented at every stage. Beer was brewed on site, but hops and dates were imported in bulk. Every item was recorded. Where it came from, who delivered it, when it arrived, how it was distributed. Mistakes such as spoiled meat or missed shipments triggered reviews and audits. Delivery teams carried clay seals proving authenticity. Fake or broken seals were a criminal offense. The entire food system was an extension of the grain tax bureaucracy, rerouted from temples and storehouses to the mouths of workers. Morale and motivation. Building a pyramid was hard, but there is growing evidence that the state took pride in its workforce, and workers in turn took pride in their task. Evidence includes graffiti etched into stone blocks, the drunkards of Menkora or the strong arms of Kafir. Songs and chants likely used to coordinate hauling rhythms. Painted stele showing workers beside their pyramids, immortalized in art. Rations were sometimes increased during holidays. Workers received linen garments, amulets, or small personal items. This wasn't generosity, it was strategic morale building. By recognizing the role of the worker, the state reinforced loyalty and productivity. Even in the most hierarchical system, the human element was never entirely lost. Abandonment and afterlife. Once a pyramid was completed, the cities that supported its creation did not endure. Many were dismantled, their materials repurposed. Others were abandoned slowly as laborers left and supplies stopped flowing. But the bureaucratic memory of these cities lived on. In temple records, in tomb inscriptions, in reused papyri, repurposed but still legible. The cities themselves became footnotes in the sand, but their designs were replicated and refined for future royal projects. Even centuries later, scribes referenced the accounting of Khufu's town as a model of organization. And so, as the pyramid rises, the city below it fades, its work complete, its story buried. But was the pyramid built by the king, or by the city that served him, stone by stone, loaf by loaf, line by line? As the last casing stones shimmered in the desert sun, and the final royal burial chamber was sealed, the monumental pyramid stood as a symbol of eternity. But for those who built it not with their hands alone, but with quills, calculations, and schedules, the real monument was something invisible yet equally lasting: a system. We explore what happened after the pyramids were completed, not just to the stones or the cities that supported them, but to the bureaucratic practices, logistical wisdom, and cultural legacy that pyramid construction left behind. For it was never just about honoring a king. It was about proving that human organization could conquer time. The blueprint of the bureaucratic machine. By the end of the 5th dynasty, Egypt had refined its construction management system into something replicable. No longer was each pyramid a unique logistical headache, it was part of a pattern. Every pyramid site had a quarrying plan, a labor camp design, a delivery and rationing network, a scribe-led record-keeping system, a phased construction schedule tied to seasonal flooding and labor availability. What began as ad hoc project management in the time of Djoser and Sneferu became, by the reigns of Sahur and Neferurkare, a kind of statewide manual, a playbook for monument building. This standardization did not limit innovation, it enabled it. Just as a modern factory refines its processes to improve output, the Egyptian state improved its construction protocols to reduce labor hours, avoid waste, improve stone quality control, eliminate bottlenecks. From the bureaucratic perspective, each pyramid wasn't just a tomb, it was a case study. The role of monumental bureaucracy in royal legitimacy. The ability to organize a pyramid project became, in itself, a measure of royal strength. Pharaohs who could not muster the administrative will, or whose governments were too weak to coordinate national labor and grain supply, did not build great pyramids. Thus, pyramid construction became a proxy for centralized power. It was no longer just about glory or divine representation. It was about showing that taxes were being collected efficiently, that local governors were submitting resources on time, that scribes were producing clean records, that the chain of command from quarry to placement was intact. In this light, failure to complete a pyramid was a political signal, evidence that the system had faltered. This is why, in later periods, even when pyramid building ceased, the bureaucratic ethos of pyramid construction persisted. The afterlife of the pyramid bureaucracy. Following the end of the Old Kingdom and the eventual shift toward rock-cut tombs and hidden burial sites, large-scale pyramid building faded. But the administrative structures it birthed did not. They were adapted for new purposes. Temple economies adopted pyramid-era provisioning systems. Canal projects were managed with the same work crew models. Royal expeditions used pyramid-style accounting to track resources and laborers. Mortuary cults used familiar quota systems to maintain offerings. The systems that once delivered millions of limestone blocks now delivered grain to temples, copper to Sinai, and papyrus to Thebes. The pyramid, in other words, became a bureaucratic training ground, a proving ground not for just stonemasons, but for scribes, quartermasters, and overseers. From these ranks came future provincial governors, tax officials, and temple administrators. The spread of pyramid-era bureaucratic culture. The reach of pyramid bureaucracy extended beyond the construction site. By the 6th dynasty, elements of pyramid planning appeared in unexpected places. Tomb autobiographies of officials like Winnie the Elder describe overseeing work crews in the same terms as pyramid managers. Temple records show adaptation of the construction ration system to daily priestly offerings. Provincial granaries adopted construction city methods for organizing storehouses and inventory rotation. Even the architectural layout of some temples mirrored the zoning of pyramid cities. Housing, storage, administration, and sacred space all precisely arranged. This reveals something profound. Pyramid bureaucracy became a national bureaucratic aesthetic, not just a tool for monuments, but a cultural model of how Egypt should be organized. What the pyramids taught Egypt about scale. No civilization before Egypt had attempted public works on the scale of the Giza pyramids, and few after it would sustain such efforts for centuries. From this endeavor, Egypt learned several things. Logistical complexity requires modularity. Each part of the project, quarry, transport, storage, labor, had to function independently, but also integrate smoothly with the others. This is a principle still used in modern project management. Bureaucracy can be a unifying force. The need to build pyramids helped Egypt develop a shared administrative culture. Local officials from distant nomes had to coordinate and report using a common bureaucratic language. Infrastructure is legacy. Though the pyramids still stand, they would not have lasted without the underlying infrastructure of canals, roads, granaries, and written records that supported their creation. Knowledge must be repeatable. The rise of manuals, standard forms, and training for scribes during the Pyramid Age shows an early attempt to institutionalize knowledge to make administration itself immortal. Did the pyramids overextend the state? A question remains, one still debated by Egyptologists and historians alike. Did the massive bureaucratic effort of pyramid building contribute to the decline of the Old Kingdom? Consider the later 6th dynasty pyramids became smaller and less precise. Inscriptions become more formulaic, suggesting a decline in scribal creativity. Provincial nobles began amassing power, while the central government strained under the weight of its own projects. Some argue that pyramid building overburdened the economy, tying up too much labor and too many resources in the name of eternity. Others say the opposite, that the loss of pyramid building weakened Egypt, removing a centralizing project that had kept the bureaucracy sharp, cohesive, and purpose-driven. Regardless, the end of the Old Kingdom did not spell the end of its bureaucratic legacy. It simply forced its adaptation. The true pyramid is invisible. In the end, what was the greatest monument of Egypt's Old Kingdom? Not the Great Pyramid of Khufu, not the Bent Pyramid or the Red Pyramid, but the invisible pyramid of administration, a structure built from hierarchies of scribes and overseers, stacks of ration records and stone logs, networks of supply ships and storage yards, work crew rotations and measurement tables. It was a system of control so powerful that it outlived the very kings it served. Stone crumbles, bureaucracy adapts. And it is this truth, quietly whispered behind the noise of cranes and chants, that defined the real legacy of pyramid building. So as the sand reclaims the cities and time fades the inscriptions, one final question remains. Is the true monument the pyramid, or the system that dared to build it, day after day, ledger after ledger, without glory but with enduring order? Story 6. The voice of stone, scribes, inks, and the power of writing. In the still hush of a reed-walled scribe's hut, far from the roar of stone cutters and the shuffle of market feet, sits a figure more powerful than a soldier, wealthier than a farmer, and more eternal than most kings. He dips his rush pen into black ink, not to draw, not to paint, but to record grain tallies, land deeds, royal decrees, and temple donations. He works in silence, yet his words will echo for centuries. He is a scribe, and in ancient Egypt the scribe was the engine of memory, management, and myth. Long before paper empires stretched across the Mediterranean, long before Rome or Byzantium etched their names into marble, Egypt had already developed a written bureaucracy, an ideological system, and a social elite whose tool was not the sword but the stylus. This is the story of how ink, not iron, shaped Egypt's empire. Why Egypt wrote it all. Egyptian writing began not with poetry or storytelling, but with something more practical: administration. From as early as 3200 BCE, simple marks on pottery and bone were used to track tax receipts, record grain storage, count livestock, identify royal goods. These early inscriptions, precursors to full hieroglyphs, were not for beauty, they were for order. Writing emerged to answer questions like, who owns this field? How much grain was delivered? Which year of the king's reign is this? Has the temple received its due offering? In other words, writing in Egypt began as a tool of accountability, not art. And from the very beginning, the man who held the pen, the scribe, held power. Hieroglyphs, hieratic in control. Egyptian writing evolved into hieroglyphs, the famous pictorial script that adorned tombs and temples. But for day-to-day work, scribes used hieratic, a flowing, cursive version that was faster and more adaptable to papyrus. Hieratic became the working language of Egypt's administration. In hieratic, scribes recorded tax records, legal contracts, birth and death registries, inventories, personal letters. This dual script system, hieroglyphs for permanence, hieratic for function, reflected Egypt's core duality, the eternal and the everyday. Scribes were trained to read both. They were the only class besides the priesthood with access to this dual power. And in a society built on regulation, ritual, and regularity, the ability to write and read was a near magical form of control. The scribe's education. To become a scribe was to enter a path of elite state service, but the journey was long and difficult. Boys began training around the age of 7 or 8, often in temple schools or state-run houses of life. Their curriculum included copying texts from classical instruction books, memorizing sign lists of hundreds of hieroglyphs, practicing account keeping using counters and tallies, learning geography, law, and ritual language. Discipline was harsh, mistakes were punished, and yet the reward was great: exemption from manual labor, access to elite circles, and a career within the machinery of state. Texts like the famous Instruction of Keti warned students. The scribe does not carry a hoe, he does not wear the yoke, he commands with the reed and men obey. For a peasant's son, scribal school was the only ladder out of the fields. And unlike warriors or priests, scribes could serve any branch of the government palace, temple, army, or granary. Tools of the trade. The scribe's toolkit was deceptively simple. A palette with 2 ink cakes, black for text, red for headings or corrections. Reed pens cut to a fine point. Papyrus rolls, made from the sliced stems of river reeds. A small pot of water to soften ink in clean pens. But in these tools lay the infrastructure of empire. Ink was made from soot and gum, cheap but enduring. Papyrus, durable in Egypt's arid climate, allowed records to last centuries. Scribes carried their kits everywhere. One carved statue shows a scribe crouching with his palette on his lap, stylus at the ready. The inscription reads, "I wrote all things the king desired, and not a line was false." The scribe was both a servant and a gatekeeper, translating royal will into fixed law. Where scribes worked. Scribes were everywhere, but each post had its own culture. Palace scribes. They recorded royal decrees, annals, military campaigns, and court ceremonies. Often close to power, some rose to become viziers, the highest officials under the king. Temple scribes. They managed ritual calendars, offerings, hymns, and temple land. Their records became repositories of religious doctrine. Military scribes. They counted soldiers, recorded supplies, and wrote campaign reports, often literate in multiple dialects. Village scribes. Known as scribes of the people, they handled contracts, land sales, and birth records. Their work formed the core of civil administration. Tomb scribes. They wrote funerary texts and ensured the correct rituals were recorded for the afterlife. In each case, scribes did more than write. They interpreted, codified, and sometimes shaped the law itself. Errors, ethics, and edits. Despite their skill, scribes made mistakes. Papyrus documents show crossed out lines, corrected names, marginal notes, and complaints. One letter complains of a scribe who inflated the grain count and falsified delivery logs. This speaks to a crucial truth. Writing did not guarantee honesty, it guaranteed documentation. To maintain credibility, scribes followed codes of conduct, often tied to the concept of cosmic and social order. Breaking that order by lying in records or forging documents was not just unethical, it was an offense against the gods. Scribes were taught that each record reflected divine balance. To write falsely was to threaten the world's harmony. Still, not all followed that rule. As power increased, so did the temptation to abuse it. When the scribe becomes the state. By the end of the Old Kingdom, the role of the scribe had expanded dramatically. Some scribes no longer simply served administrators, they became administrators. Tomb inscriptions from the 6th dynasty show scribes with titles like overseer of the king's granaries, inspector of the pyramid fields, chief justice, and vizier. These were not symbolic roles. They held real power over taxation, justice, and labor. And their tombs, sometimes grander than those of minor nobles, reflected a new reality. The pen had become mightier than the bloodline. Egypt was becoming a state not only of priests and warriors, but of record keepers. But what happens when those who write the law also interpret it? When scribes are no longer the tools of the state, but the architects of its memory? By the time the Old Kingdom reached its twilight in the 6th dynasty, the scribe had become far more than a mere clerk. He had transformed into a cultural institution, a political agent, and most importantly, a symbol of enduring state order. To write was not only to record, it was to shape memory, define legality, and preserve reality. We examine how scribes transitioned from humble administrators to a professional class with real influence, shaping both the inner workings of Egypt and the very identity of its bureaucratic civilization. As literacy remained rare, scribes occupied a space between the king and the people, a bridge of ink between command and compliance. Let us walk through the dusty archives, trace the authority of the stylus, and see how the scribe became an indispensable force in Egyptian governance. Literacy as power, who could write and who could. Contrary to popular myth, ancient Egypt was not a literate society in the broad sense. Literacy was largely confined to professional scribes, trained in schools or temple settings, high-ranking priests, select officials, often from elite families. Peasants, artisans, and most merchants were illiterate. Even some members of the nobility, though they could recognize royal names or ceremonial signs, relied on scribes for formal documentation. This created a fundamental imbalance. The few who could read and write controlled access to knowledge, law, and property. Everyone else had to trust that their contracts, birth records, and land boundaries were being recorded truthfully. This imbalance created power, but also responsibility. The scribe class, though privileged, was expected to maintain balance, justice, truth. This moral and cosmic obligation was baked into the ideology of the profession. Texts such as the Instruction of Tahotep taught young scribes, "Do not be boastful because of your knowledge. Speak to the ignorant as to the wise, for the limits of skill are hidden." In this way, the scribe's role was not only technical, it was ethical. The scribe's class identity. By the Middle Kingdom, a distinct scribe class had emerged. These men, and possibly a few women, though rare in records, shared specialized education from temple or palace schools. A symbolic uniform, often shown shirtless, seated cross-legged with palette. Professional titles and ranks. Standardized career paths. Apprentice right arrow, junior scribe right arrow, inspector right arrow, overseer. Their identity was reinforced through art and statuary, especially the famous seated scribe statues. Instructional texts passed down from generation to generation. Family ties, sons of scribes often became scribes, suggesting a hereditary professional caste. These features mark the scribe class as a proto-bureaucracy, a self-sustaining group with institutional continuity, independent of royal lineage. Even if the king changed, the scribes remained. Their power lay not in land or arms, but in accumulated administrative memory. The tools of governance. What exactly did scribes do that made them so essential? Legal formalization. No contract, marriage, sale, inheritance, or divorce was valid without a scribe's inscription and seal. These records were often archived in local temples or gnome capitals. Tax assessment and collection. Scribes recorded harvest estimates, calculated obligations, and issued receipts. A misplaced line or decimal could change a family's fate. Construction oversight. During pyramid building and canal dredging, scribes kept logs of daily labor, materials used, and rations distributed. Religious text. Scribes copied hymns, offering lists, and ritual instructions, maintaining consistency in worship. Diplomacy. In the New Kingdom and beyond, scribes wrote and read foreign scripts, enabling international correspondence. In short, every organ of the Egyptian state, economic, legal, religious, military, ran through the hands of scribes. Record-keeping as ritual. Egyptian culture imbued writing with a sacred dimension. To record something was not only to preserve it, it was to legitimize it. Hence, royal decrees were carved in stone or copper, meant to last eternally. Tomb inscriptions spoke of deeds not just remembered, but made real through writing. Names, if erased, were believed to doom the soul to oblivion. In this context, the scribe's task became quasi-priestly. He safeguarded not only law but identity. Scribes were often attached to temples as servants of the God's word. Their duty was to copy sacred texts exactly, preserving ritual formulas that connected the present to the eternal past. A mistake in a funerary spell could mean the deceased failed to reach the afterlife. Accuracy was, quite literally, salvation. Famous scribes and their legacies. While most scribes worked anonymously, a few rose to prominence. Imhotep III dynasty, the architect of Djoser's step pyramid, was also a scribe, priest, and physician. He later became deified, showing the reverence afforded to scribal skill. Tahotep V dynasty, his instruction text shaped scribal ethics for centuries, emphasizing humility, order, and restraint. Amenemhotep, late New Kingdom. His wisdom texts influenced not only Egyptian scribes but may have parallels in biblical proverbs. These men show that scribes could become philosophers, architects, advisors, and even divine figures, a testament to their influence across every facet of Egyptian culture. The limits of scribe power. While scribes wielded immense administrative power, their status depended on proximity to central authority. During the first intermediate period, as royal control fragmented, scribal training decentralized, standards declined, local officials created their own scribes, leading to record-keeping chaos. This reveals a paradox. Writing enabled centralized governance, but without a strong center, the writing became divided, contradictory, and untrustworthy. The recovery of Egypt in the Middle Kingdom included not just new kings, but a restoration of scribal standards, a bureaucratic renaissance. Order could not return until the scribes were back in control. Bureaucratic introspection, the scribe on himself. Egyptian literature includes a fascinating genre, scribal self-praise. In texts like the Satire of the Trades, scribes mock other professions. Be a scribe, it is greater than all professions. You are not forced to carry a hoe. The bricklayer's knees are swollen. The washerman smells of fish. The soldier dies far from home. These texts served multiple purposes. Reinforce the elite identity of scribes. Encourage youth to pursue education. Validate the central role of writing in state function. But beneath the humor lies a truth. Scribes saw themselves as essential, but underappreciated the unsung organizers of the world. In their eyes, the pyramid may have the king's name, but it was the scribe who recorded the stone count. So we are left with a profession both powerful and humble, both invisible and eternal. But how did the scribes ensure their survival through Egypt's many rises and falls? And what happens when writing becomes not just record but ideology itself? The Egyptian scribe sat not only with a pen in hand, but with the past in his grasp. In a world without printing presses, digital archives, or permanent books, the act of writing and rewriting became the act of remembrance. But remembrance in Egypt was selective. The scribe, both guardian and gatekeeper, had the final say in what was preserved, what was emphasized, and what was forgotten. As we close this story, we explore the scribe's most enduring legacy, historical authorship. We ask not only how they preserved Egypt's memory, but how they shaped it, crafting an official version of time, empire, and identity. In their records lie the truths of bureaucracy, but also the quiet power of cultural control. The scribe as historian. Unlike modern historians who aim for objectivity, however imperfectly, Egyptian scribes wrote history as a function of legitimacy. Their records were meant to glorify the king, justify the current regime, reinforce the cosmic balance, Mot. This meant that military defeats were rarely mentioned, controversial successions were smoothed over, and natural disasters were attributed to divine displeasure, quickly followed by the king's restoration of order. For instance, the reign of Pepi II, likely marked by increasing decentralization, is remembered in inscriptions as a golden age. The civil wars of the first intermediate period are rarely described in official texts. Most records leap from the Old Kingdom to the reunification under the Middle Kingdom. What we know of these gaps comes from tomb biographies of local officials, less controlled, temple inscriptions with layered meanings, later scribal compilations, sometimes inconsistent. This reveals a core truth. The scribes preserved history not as it was, but as it ought to have been. Archiving Egypt, storage and loss. How were records kept? Where did scribes store this mass of state memory? Egypt's great archives included palace archives, containing decrees, annals, building logs, and royal correspondence. Temple libraries, housing ritual texts, astronomical observations, and priestly registers. Houses of life, attached to major temples, where scribes copied medical, magical, and theological works. Administrative storehouses, where tax receipts, census rolls, and shipping manifests were filed. Most of these archives were made of papyrus, vulnerable to rot, fire, and looting. But Egypt's dry climate preserved many scrolls, particularly in tombs, where scribes and priests were buried with texts they had written or copied. Yet vast amounts of documentation were still lost. The shifting of capitals, invasions, and even political purges saw archives destroyed or edited. For example, in the Amarna period, traditional gods were rejected by Akhenaten. Many religious texts were censored. Later scribes attempted to restore lost works, but what was permanently altered, we may never know. Scribal control of archives meant they controlled what future generations could access. Editing the afterlife. Scribes also shaped religious memory. The famous funerary texts like the pyramid texts, coffin texts, and later the Book of the Dead were not static. They evolved. Scribes adapted, expanded, and sometimes reinterpreted these texts. In the Old Kingdom, only kings had pyramid spells. In the Middle Kingdom, elite non-royals began using coffin texts, democratizing the afterlife. By the New Kingdom, scribes had created full books of the dead with illustrations, standardized chapters, and personalization. This evolution wasn't spontaneous. It was the product of hundreds of years of scribal transmission, where each copy introduced subtle changes, some errors, some innovations, some ideological shifts. Through this, scribes not only preserved religious belief, but shaped it, crafting a narrative of death, judgment, and salvation that matched the changing political and theological climate. They didn't just write the journey to the afterlife, they rewrote it, over and over again, until it reflected the world the living believed in. Scribal propaganda and political control. In times of crisis or transition, scribes became agents of stability. They wrote public inscriptions that praised the incoming king, declared the restoration of order, blamed disorder on foreigners or neglect of the gods. One notable example comes from the reign of Horemheb, 18th dynasty. His inscriptions claimed he purged corrupt officials and restored Maat after the Amarna heresy. But archaeological evidence suggests Horemheb may have been part of that previous regime. It was the scribes who smoothed this over. Likewise, scribes edited king lists like the Abydos king list to skip over unpopular or illegitimate rulers. Pharaohs like Akhenaten, Smenkhkare, and even Hatshepsut were omitted to preserve a tidy succession. This was not clumsiness, it was policy. Writing the past became a method of legitimizing the present. When the pen becomes tradition, over time, the scribe himself became a symbol of cultural continuity. In later periods, New Kingdom and onward, scribes were idealized not just as workers, but as emblems of Egyptian identity. Statues of seated scribes were placed in tombs as models of good administration. Instructional texts were copied centuries after they were written, kept alive as wisdom literature. Literacy itself was seen as a moral virtue, even as most of the population remained illiterate. In the face of foreign rule from Libyans to Persians to Greeks, it was the scribal tradition that persisted. Greek visitors marveled at Egypt's scribes, still writing on scrolls, still preserving rituals, still reading ancient signs no outsider could understand. Egypt's political masters changed, but its scribal elite remained. The decline of the scribe. Eventually, even the scribe could not escape time. By the late period and Ptolemaic era, Demotic script replaced hieratic, and Greek replaced Egyptian in official correspondence. Scribes began learning both, but their status declined. Under Roman rule, many temples and houses of life were closed. Professional scribes were absorbed into new administrative systems or lost their relevance entirely. But their records endured. Buried in tombs, hidden in temple walls, preserved by desert dryness, the writings of Egypt's scribes reached the modern world. We read them today not just as history, but as evidence of a culture that believed to write was to exist. Legacy beyond Egypt. The idea of writing as governance born in Egypt echoes through history. Babylonian cuneiform developed similar record-keeping practices. Roman bureaucrats adopted Egyptian methods in managing taxes and provinces. Islamic administrators during the caliphates referenced Egyptian precedents in land survey and taxation. Modern civil services, with their paper trails and performance reports, owe something to the scribes who first counted cattle, filed offerings, and wrote receipts in red and black ink. Even our word bureaucracy, though French in origin, carries the spirit of these early state scribes, men who believed that authority should be recorded and that no order was real until it was written. So as we trace the fatting lines of ink across brittle papyrus, we must ask, were the scribes merely servants of the state, or were they the architects of memory itself? Without them, what would we know of ancient Egypt or of ourselves?